What if the hero who saved the world was erased from history just because of the color of his eyes? This is the reality of Abel, a legendary mage who defeated the Lord of Twilight, only to be betrayed and exiled by his own companion. His punishment? Having golden eyes, the very same mark as the most feared demons. In a world where eye color defines your destiny, Abel's amber eyes are treated as a curse. He's called useless, rejected by everyone, humiliated by nobles who can barely cast a fireball. But what they don't know is that Abel masters all the elements and holds secrets from a lost era. Refusing isolation, he uses forbidden reincarnation magic and awakens 200 years in the future. Now, no one recognizes him, and that's exactly how he wants it. He just wants peace, ancient books, and a quiet school life. The problem? His overwhelming power keeps attracting attention, including from some very stubborn girls. Between an unexpected kiss from a beautiful demoness who waited centuries for him and a duchess who only cares about the strong, Abel will realize going unnoticed is impossible. Get ready to witness the most underestimated mage in history make an epic comeback. This story is really good, so leave a like and comment, Golden Eyes. The more comments, the faster I bring the continuation. No more stalling. Let's get to the video. A man named Abel stood still with magic swirling around his hand. As the others watched, he unleashed a spell at the enemy. In that moment, the Lord of Twilight, the being who had plunged the world into darkness, was finally defeated by Roy's hero party. Or rather, by Abel himself. Even so, people continued to fear the Twilight. One day, Roy told Abel that his amber eyes no longer had a place in this peaceful world. He then asked Abel to take charge of the party, leaving him completely stunned. In this world, a person's eyes revealed the nature of their magical power. Those gifted with fire magic were born with ruby-colored eyes. Sapphire eyes signified an affinity with water, while emerald eyes represented wind. However, those capable of wielding every element possessed a golden amber glow in their eyes. Yet most demons also had Zampir eyes, just like Abel. Because of that, humans who carried those eyes were branded as reincarnated demons. As a result, Abel became the target of fear and hatred. In this way, the gift of amber eyes was both a blessing and a curse. For that reason, Roy believed Abel would be viewed as a symbol of misfortune during times of peace. He pointed out a remote island and arranged for Abel to live in a village that had been prepared there. Hearing this, Abel realized Roy intended to keep him confined, despite being his longtime companion. Moreover, he understood that Roy also wanted him out of sight, so he accepted the decision and declared that he would leave and never return. Even so, he made it clear that he would not accept the offer of isolation. Despite everything, Abel did not place all the blame on them, because the true issue was the way society treated those with Zampir eyes, a flaw common in an immature civilization. After departing from the group, he sought shelter deep within the mountains. Inside an ancient laboratory, he perfected a spell that no one in modern society was capable of mastering. Using that reincarnation magic, he sealed everything inside a magical coffin. He envisioned a future 200 years ahead, a world where magic might accomplish the impossible. In such an age, perhaps people would be more accepting, especially toward those who possessed Zampir eyes. 200 years later, Abel finally emerged from the coffin. Upon awakening, he immediately inspected his body. Soon after, he noticed how easily the coffin crumbled after being left untouched for so long. If his reincarnation spell had truly worked, then 2 centuries must have passed. With that thought in mind, he examined himself and realized his soul now resided in a body resembling his younger self. Although he could have created a more attractive appearance, he still felt attached to the way he had once looked. In this era, there was no one left who knew him, so it hardly mattered. Suddenly, he heard a sound and instantly sensed the presence of a demon. Turning toward the door, he realized the footsteps belonged to a woman. He wondered whether demons had learned how to disguise themselves as humans. Furthermore, they must have become quite skilled, considering the cave was surrounded by protective spells. Because of that, he questioned whether the barrier had weakened over the past 2 centuries. Even so, he had not yet tested the limits of his youthful new body, so caution was necessary. As the door slowly creaked open, he began preparing a surprise attack as a precaution. He considered striking the intruder with his most powerful magic in order to gain the upper hand. When the door opened completely, he started casting the spell, but suddenly noticed something and quickly clenched his fist to cancel the magic. The woman then came into view, yet she remained frozen in shock as she stared at him. Seeing her, Abel began wondering who she could be. Then he noticed her sapphire eyes, the mark of water magic, and questioned whether she was truly human. Without warning, the basket she was carrying slipped from her hands and fell to the ground. She collapsed to her knees, and tears streamed down her face as she called out his name. Then he exclaimed that he had been waiting for that day for a very long time. Hearing this, Abel realized she was not a demon, but he still could not recognize her and began wondering whether he had ever met someone like her before. At that moment, a memory resurfaced. Back then, Roy had questioned whether Abel had lost his mind. Roy pointed out that, even if she was only a child, that girl was still a demon and an enemy. Nevertheless, Abel chose to spare the young demon girl's life. Shortly after defeating the ruler of darkness, he stated that a mere child posed no threat, and that killing her would change nothing. Roy was stunned by that decision, remembering the girl who had cried so desperately back then. He realized she was still crying, though he had never imagined things would come this far. After 200 years, the woman was clearly astonished by his words. B remarked that it had been an incredibly long time since he had last seen her. Hearing that, she began crying once more. She introduced herself as Lilith and said that she had finally found him. For more than a century, she had searched for him, determined to repay the debt of gratitude she owed him. At last, she had discovered the place where he intended to reincarnate. Hearing this, Abel remarked that time had probably weakened the cave's magic. Setting that thought aside, he turned his attention back to her. He observed that her eyes had once carried the same shade as his own. It was widely believed that eye color reflected the color of a person's soul, so he wondered whether she had somehow managed to change her eyes. As he thought about it, he admitted that he had never succeeded in doing such a thing himself. In response, she said it would be quicker to show him. She then raised her hands to her face and removed what she had been wearing. To his surprise, when she opened her eyes again, they revealed their true amber color. Afterwards, she showed him the item in her hands and explained that it was called a contact lens. Upon examining it closely, Abel was amazed that such a thin, transparent layer could completely change the color of a person's eyes. After all, this world had endured a long and painful history of discrimination based solely on eye color. Countless conflicts and lost lives had occurred simply because of the color of someone's eyes. The thought that something so simple could have prevented all of that left him speechless. Before he could dwell on it further, Lil took something out of her basket. As she wrapped a scarf around his neck, she mentioned that she had prepared a house nearby. Abel was puzzled by the scarf, so she explained that it was meant to keep him warm because it was cold outside. When they stepped out of the cave, Abel was stunned by the scenery. He saw snow covering the land as far as the eye could see, along with a small village at the foot of the mountain. As they made their way down, he realized just how long Lilith had waited for his return, even though she never expressed it directly. Not long afterward, they arrived at a spacious home furnished with everything one could need. Inside, Abel saw an electric lamp for the first time, along with a private library. Noticing his reaction, Lilith explained that she knew how much he loved reading, so she believed books would be the best way for him to learn about the modern world. That prompted Abel to thank her. Later, while reading, he reflected on how books had been the ultimate luxury 200 years ago. Back then, paper had been expensive and every book had to be copied by hand. Now, however, it seemed that a technological revolution had taken place. People had developed a magical stone capable of transforming into various forms of energy depending on how it was used. Thanks to that breakthrough, civilization had advanced at a remarkable pace. After learning this, he also guessed that the lamps were probably powered by those magical stones. Even so, he wondered why magic alone was no longer enough, and concluded that modern mages had grown lazy. After spending some time reading, the book slipped from his hands when he realized his suspicions had been correct. He discovered that the overall skill level of present-day mages had declined drastically. Furthermore, what was now celebrated as groundbreaking magic had been basic knowledge for children 200 years earlier. Even so, many of those books proudly presented magical formulas riddled with flaws. Anyone who used them as a foundation would create spells full of errors and vulnerable to catastrophic failures. Still, he concluded that while technology had moved forward, magic itself had regressed. But a sudden noise interrupted his thoughts. Listening carefully, he realized it was coming from somewhere inside the house, yet the footsteps did not sound like Lilith's. That made him wonder where she had gone. Suddenly, someone shouted at him and startled him. A boy appeared and confidently assumed that Abel must be Lilith's younger brother. Seeing this, Abel wondered who the boy was and whether he knew Lilith. Without warning, the boy told him to be happy. Then he introduced himself as Ted and proudly announced that Abel would now be under his guidance. Hearing that, Abel wondered whether Ted was trying to make him his disciple. However, he noticed Ted's extravagant clothing and suspected that he might be a noble. Suddenly, he remembered the nearby mansion and wondered if it belonged to Ted. Regardless, Abel had no interest in becoming involved in a master-disciple relationship with him. Even so, Ted refused to give up and enthusiastically continued trying to persuade Abel to become his disciple. As the persistence dragged on, Abel found himself wishing the boy would simply give up. With that in mind, he decided to frighten him away. After calmly closing his book, he told Ted to keep his distance. He then revealed his eyes and asked whether Ted understood what they meant. Ted showed surprise when he saw them, but soon appeared even more confident than before. Abel explained that those eyes were associated with demons, yet Ted merely burst out laughing in amusement. He pointed at Abel's amber eyes while continuing to laugh. He said it was his first time seeing such eyes, and that he was amazed they actually existed. However, that reaction left Abel confused because the boy did not seem frightened at all. At that moment, another person arrived and called out to Ted. When he saw him, he reminded Ted not to enter Lilith's house without permission. As soon as Ted noticed him, he excitedly called him his older brother. He asked his brother to take a look at Abel and remarked that he had never seen such unusual eyes before, leaving Abel bewildered. Suddenly, Biz carefully examined Abel's eyes. Then he recalled that Lily had once mentioned that her extraordinarily talented brother would be living there, though Biz seemed to have expected someone more impressive. Suddenly, Ted declared that amber eyes like Abel's had no affinity for any magical attribute. He claimed that people with such eyes were incapable of using the major branches of magic and were therefore useless. Hearing that statement, Abel was taken aback. In reality, Zampar eyes required an exceptionally long period of training. For the first 10 years, a person could not properly use any magical attribute. After that period, however, they could master every one of them. Although individual talent varied, they were capable of performing top-tier magic across all elements. Even so, people with those eyes had been persecuted throughout history, despite their undeniable and extraordinary potential. Meanwhile, Bez began scolding Ted for taking things too far. He reminded him that a person could still live a meaningful life even without magic. With that, he assured Abel that they could rely on one another and hoped they would get along well. Hearing that, Abel wondered whether Bez also considered people with Zampar eyes to be worthless. Before leaving, Bez instructed Ted to return home and continue studying, since the chosen ones had a destiny they were expected to fulfill. In response, Ted agreed and cheerfully said goodbye to Abel. Once the door closed, Abel felt drained after the brothers had suddenly appeared, criticized him, and left just as quickly. He now understood the situation based on the historical accounts of war that he had been reading. The demon race had not been at war with humanity for roughly 100 years. As a result, the world had entered an era of peace. With demons no longer posing a constant threat, people stopped fearing Zampar eyes. However, as magical proficiency declined, those with Zampar eyes, which required extensive training, became the subject of ridicule. Because of this, he found it difficult to believe that after suffering so much persecution in the past, they were now merely mocked. Knowing that, he began to wonder whether living an ordinary life was truly so difficult for them. Later, Lilith finally returned. The moment he saw her, Abel assumed she was a servant, but with a smile she clarified that the modern term was housemaid. She asked whether the uniform suited her, and he agreed that it did. Setting that aside, Abel told her that he had finally understood. He now realized why she had gone to such lengths to conceal the color of her eyes. He explained that over the course of 2 centuries, Zampar eyes had gone from being a symbol of immense power to something people laughed at. Life had become more difficult for those with Zampar eyes, and perhaps that was why Lilith hid hers behind contact lenses. In response, Lilith explained that the demon race had grown weaker during the last 2 centuries. After the hero's party defeated the Dark Sovereign, humanity continued hunting down the remaining demons. As peace gradually spread across the world, the overall standard of magical ability began to decline. As a consequence, the fear surrounding Amber Eyes vanished, and people forgot that those eyes could become extraordinarily powerful through training. After considering that, Abel asked whether she still held resentment toward humans despite being a demon, but she merely smiled and reminded him of what he had done for her in the past. He had traveled with her in search of a safe place where she could live. He had also taught her magic and shown her how to blend into human society. Then she stepped closer and expressed how deeply she admired him. With a smile, she added that she had a small request if he truly cared about her. Later, while Lilith scrubbed his back, Abel found himself wondering how things had somehow reached this point. Suddenly, she told him that his concern for her made her so happy that she could no longer keep her feelings contained. In response, he asked whether she understood what it meant for them to be sharing a bath together, but she replied that it was amusing to hear such words from someone who looked so young. She then embraced him and added that his words might not carry much authority, but they still made her happy, especially because someone like him acknowledged her as a woman. Seeing that, Abel fell silent. That night, they slept in the same bed. For the first time in 200 years, Abel experienced genuine peace while sleeping. After his reincarnation, Abel gradually settled into a routine. He spent his mornings having breakfast with Lilith and his afternoons in the library studying the modern world. However, every day around noon, someone inevitably barged into the room. That person was Ted, who stubbornly continued calling him Chicken Eyes. Abel assumed the boy simply wanted a friend of the same age to play with, but he had no intention of entertaining him, so he cast an enhancement spell on his leg. Then he leaped out the window, saying he had no time to play children's games. Ted was stunned when he saw it, but soon realized that Abel had landed safely on the roof of a nearby building. He immediately began wondering in disbelief how Abel was able to move like that. Ted had no idea that it was only a tiny fraction of Abel's enhancement magic, yet it was already enough to amaze him. Determined not to be left behind, Ted began casting strengthening magic on himself. Afterward, he also jumped through the window. Watching this, Abel noticed that Ted was at least capable of using basic body enhancement magic. However, his control was poor, and a large amount of raw magic was leaking away. That wasted energy and made his movements highly inefficient. As expected, Ted began to fall and eventually crashed into a nearby bush. Abel quickly climbed down after him and asked whether he was alright. In response, Ted immediately sprang out of the bushes. He then shouted at Abel not to worry and charged toward him. However, Abel simply flew upward to avoid him, causing Ted to slam into a nearby wall. As Ted complained about the pain in his face, Abel remarked that he was surprisingly tough and added that with another 20 years of training, Ted might become a reasonably capable mage. Hearing that, Ted scolded him for failing to act like a proper subordinate, but Abel replied that he had never agreed to such a thing. However, he paused when a thought suddenly crossed his mind. Then he told Ted that if he truly insisted, he would not mind becoming his subordinate. The moment he heard that, Ted became excited, believing that Abel had finally found some motivation. However, Abel immediately clarified that there was a condition. Suddenly, he remembered how Lilith had given him the scarf to protect him from the cold in a village where snow covered the land for half the year. It was a valuable item. Even so, he told Ted that if he could take the scarf before sunset, he would become his subordinate. Ted instantly declared that it would be easy. Without Ted realizing it, Abel had been looking for a way to deal with the constant interruptions to his studies. So he decided to turn the situation into physical training while Ted chased after him. In his view, it would be beneficial for both of them. Before long, Ted was already begging him to slow down. Yet Abel kept jumping higher and farther as he evaluated the average level of magical ability in this era. Meanwhile, Ted was astonished by Abel's movements and genuinely believed he could still keep up with him. He cast enhancement magic on his feet and attempted to leap upward, only to crash straight into a wall. Watching this, Abel became aware of just how vast the gap between their abilities truly was. Ted kept trying to jump and stubbornly continued his attempts to snatch Abel's scarf. As Abel effortlessly avoided him, he found himself genuinely surprised. By now, Ted should have realized how inefficient his physical movements were. Even so, he kept jumping around without using magic and continued chasing him with determination. Seeing him stumble repeatedly, Abel concluded that Ted was no longer handsome and certainly was not the brightest person around. However, he did possess a fair amount of endurance. Even so, he was unbelievably noisy every time he hit the ground. Once again, Ted asked why Abel was not tired, but Abel assumed their training methods had simply been different. When Ted got back on his feet, Abel remarked that sunset was still far away, yet he already looked ready to quit. In response, Ted charged forward again, reaching for the scarf, but his movements were far too slow. Abel sidestepped him with ease. He was moving so sluggishly that Abel merely slapped his hand aside. Eventually, Ted announced that he could not continue and collapsed onto the ground. Observing him, Abel realized that Ted had lasted about 20 minutes longer than expected. He probably carried noble blood. Knowing that Ted possessed at least some basic physical training, Abel decided to return to the library. However, something caught his attention. He glanced toward a nearby window and spotted Bez speaking animatedly with someone. Curious, Abel enhanced his hearing to listen more closely. As their voices became clearer, he heard Lilith saying that she could not be in a relationship with Bez. That immediately surprised Abel. A moment later, he heard Bez asking what was wrong with him. At that point, Abel realized he had accidentally stumbled into a romantic conversation. Even so, he knew that Bez was a proud nobleman who would likely take rejection very badly. Suddenly, Lilith replied that it was not because she was dissatisfied with him. Instead, she revealed that her heart already belonged to someone else. Hearing that, Abel froze. Meanwhile, Bez clenched his teeth in frustration and demanded to know whether the person she loved was Abel. Lilith looked directly toward him and cheerfully answered that it was. Bez heard her clearly and was stunned. On the other hand, he quickly became furious when he concluded that she had fallen in love with her own brother. He called her shameless and insisted that she ought to be ashamed of herself. Witnessing that reaction, Abel was completely confused. He could not understand why Bez considered it immoral and felt the judgment was excessively harsh even if they truly were siblings. Besides, he was not actually Lilith's brother, though she had probably allowed him to believe that to make her explanation easier. Meanwhile, Bez continued scolding Lilith for loving her own brother, repeatedly insisting that such feelings were wrong. Watching this unfold, Abel began growing irritated by Bez's remarks. However, since it had merely been an unexpected rejection, he decided to pretend he had not seen anything. From that day onward, Ted continued chasing Abel, and it gradually became part of their daily routine. As time passed, Abel arrived at a conclusion after observing Ted. While Ted relentlessly pursued him, Abel realized that his ruby eyes, famed for their exceptional affinity with fire magic, did not seem to correspond to any remarkable talent in this era. Without natural ability, mastering elemental magic became an extremely difficult challenge. As he landed atop a rooftop, Abel thought that perhaps such magic was simply too complicated for someone as straightforward as Ted. Nevertheless, Ted copied his movement and made a high leap of his own. Seeing him imitate the maneuver, Abel confirmed that Ted did possess some aptitude for physical enhancement. Unlike mental-based magic, that discipline relied much more on instinct than logical thinking. As a result, he concluded that this type of magic might suit Ted better because of his simple and direct personality. At that moment, Ted rushed forward again, closing the distance between them. Abel reflected on how much progress Ted had made over the past several days. Even so, he had not forgotten that Bez was nearby and observing Ted's training alongside him. At that moment, Abel grabbed Ted's wrist, while thinking that 2 centuries ago, someone like him would have been considered merely average. Even so, he threw Ted aside. While evaluating his performance, he remarked that he had improved only slightly. Then he kicked Ted's leg and added that an attack with that amount of force would not even bother a fly. As a result, Ted tumbled into the snow and slid across the rooftop. Eventually, he reached the edge of the roof and came to a stop, then stood up in frustration and shouted at Abel. But the moment he took a step, his foot slipped. He lost his balance, and before Abel could react, Ted had already fallen from the roof. He struck the ground hard and immediately grabbed his leg in pain. Seeing this, Abel hurried down to check on him and worried that he might have fractured his ankle. Although healing magic was not his specialty, he prepared to use a recovery spell. However, Bez arrived suddenly and immediately shoved Abel aside so that he could cast the healing spell himself. Witnessing that, Abel was surprised that Bez could use recovery magic despite not possessing Zampar eyes. He realized then that he might have underestimated Bez. However, he soon noticed something strange. As Bez began casting the spell, Ted cried out in pain. Seeing that, Abel became even more concerned. That was because healing magic functioned much like building something out of blocks. The more advanced the spell, the more precise and detailed the construction needed to be. Normally, the process started with larger blocks and gradually moved to smaller ones to maintain proper balance. B's rushed approach was like placing a massive block on top of a tiny one and simply forcing them together. B's continued casting the spell. As a result, Ted screamed even louder in pain. Watching this, Abel realized that the treatment could cause nerves and tissues to press dangerously against one another. He then told Bez to take Ted to the infirmary instead of continuing, but Bez immediately snapped that he had not asked for Abel's opinion. He then accused Abel of being responsible for Ted's fall as well. He reminded him that Ted was a noble, the second son of the Lengardia family, while Abel was nothing more than a commoner. By contrast, Abel was merely a country bumpkin with inferior eyes. Because of that, he declared that insulting a noble would not be tolerated. Drawing his sword, Bez announced that Abel would answer for this offense, and that justice would show him no mercy. He proclaimed that the matter could only be settled through a duel. Seeing this, Abel was taken aback. Ted was still injured and clearly in pain, yet Bez seemed completely blinded by his anger. On top of that, a crowd had already begun gathering because of the commotion, and attracting so much attention in the middle of town was unwise. Even so, Abel answered Bez calmly and stated that he would accept the challenge. Hearing that, Bez explained that the duel would be one-on-one and that the first person to surrender would be declared the loser. Taking their age difference into account, Bez offered Abel a handicap. However, Abel declined and told him to begin immediately, which caught Bez off guard. Even so, Abel had no time to waste. After all, he was partly responsible for the situation, and Ted needed proper medical care. With that in mind, he hoped Ted could endure a little longer. Meanwhile, Bez grew even angrier, interpreting Abel's attitude as an insult and wanting to make him regret it. Bez raised his sword and activated a spell called Window. As the attack rushed toward him, Abel dodged swiftly and silently acknowledged that Bez was more capable than he had initially thought. When he saw a nearby tree sliced cleanly in half by the spell, he concluded that Bez's power was average, but his spell construction speed was remarkable. 2 centuries earlier, only Abel had been capable of creating spells that quickly. For that reason, seeing Bez accomplish it without appearing particularly exceptional made Abel suspicious. He began wondering whether the sword itself was responsible and whether it concealed some sort of mechanism. At that moment, Bez asked if it was Abel's first time seeing a regalia. Confused, Abel remained silent. Bez then assumed he came from a backward region and explained that a regalia accelerated spell construction. Thanks to it, he could activate magic at overwhelming speed. Having said that, he swung his sword once more and launched another attack. The spell relentlessly pursued Abel, forcing him to dodge continuously. Observing carefully, Abel realized that a magical power source had been embedded within the sword. Even so, in his eyes, it was nothing more than an expensive toy. Suddenly, Bez began unleashing a rapid barrage of attacks to display his strength. Nevertheless, Abel avoided every single one with ease. He found the whole situation ridiculous because he had no time to waste on such nonsense. Growing irritated, he decided to stop one of the attacks with his bare hand. Witnessing that, Bez was completely stunned. Meanwhile, Abel concluded that Regalius had accelerated the decline of modern magical skill. The tool was so convenient that mages had come to believe there was no longer any need to learn how to construct spells from scratch. As a result, in a world without demons, such thinking might not be dangerous, but Abel realized that Regalius had robbed mages of their ability to think critically. Even so, since Bez had helped him test his theory, Abel felt it was only fair to demonstrate the difference in strength between them. Confused, Bez asked what he meant by showing true power. Abel's eyes began to shine. Magic gathered in his hands as he cast a far more powerful version of Window. The completed spell shot toward Bez, who attempted to block it but was blasted backward. Even so, it was obvious that Abel had merely added flashy effects to emphasize the difference in skill between them, and had been holding back the entire time. On the other hand, Bez could not accept the fact that he had been defeated by a commoner with inferior eyes. Before he could finish speaking, however, someone suddenly appeared. Lilith kicked him squarely in the face with enough force to slam him into the ground. She then calmly stated that she might have overlooked it if only she had been insulted, but she would never forgive anyone who insulted Abel. Turning toward Bez, she asked whether he truly valued his own life. Seeing this, Bez could hardly believe what he was hearing from Lilith. Meanwhile, Abel was clearly worried about her. Later that night, the doctor informed Ted that a complete recovery would take approximately 6 months. He acknowledged that Ted wanted to get back to playing as soon as possible, but advised him to be patient. After the door closed, Ted began wondering whether it would really take that long to heal. Without his knowledge, Abel was standing outside the window. After thinking it over for a moment, Abel cast a teleportation spell and entered Ted's room. Once inside, he recalled that he had originally decided to leave the treatment to the town's doctors. That was because he wanted to evaluate their medical abilities. However, 6 months was far too long, so he began treating Ted with healing magic himself. As he worked, he removed the lingering effects of the poorly executed spell Bez had used. He also realigned the bone structure through exceptionally precise reinforcement magic. While carrying out the treatment, Abel reflected that he should have prevented Ted's fall from the beginning. Feeling responsible, he quietly whispered an apology to the sleeping Ted. The following day, Abel left the house but was surprised to find Bez waiting outside. Slightly confused, he casually addressed him by name, but Bez immediately corrected him and insisted that he should say Lord Bez, since he was only a commoner. Without warning, Bez was struck on the head. As he dropped to his knees in pain, the man standing beside him politely greeted Abel. The man introduced himself as Evans and explained that he wished to apologize for the previous incident. Abel was puzzled by such excessive formality. To his surprise, Evans dropped to one knee before him and apologized for his son's behavior. Confused, Bez asked his father why he was bowing to a commoner with inferior eyes. He also pointed out that Abel was merely the brother of a maid they had hired. In response, Evans smacked him on the head once again. He then explained that the misunderstanding was his own fault because he had never told Bez the truth. Next, he revealed that they were not employing Lilith at all. In reality, it was Lilith who had hired them. Hearing that, Bez was left completely speechless. Meanwhile, Abel finally understood what was going on. After all, he had often wondered why a high-ranking demon like Lilith would humble herself before humans. Thinking back on history, he knew that demons had endured countless hardships in order to coexist with humanity and survive. Some demons had even assumed the identities of nobles while quietly using their powers to influence society. Therefore, Lilith had probably adapted to the modern era through similar means. After that encounter, Abel never saw Bez again. According to Evans, Bez had enrolled in the Heresia Magic Academy, an institution famous for producing elite mages. Later, Evans shared a story with Ted about a snowy day. On that day, he had gone hunting in the forest and was attacked by a monster. It was Lilith who saved him. Using her magic, she defeated the beast. At the time, he considered himself incredibly fortunate. From that day onward, she had supported their family, serving both as a kind neighbor and as a guide through life. The word guide caught Ted's attention, so Evans encouraged him to continue getting along with them, and Ted eagerly agreed. That was because he had already come to regard Abel as a close friend. He also remembered how his leg had been healed and felt that he owed Abel both an apology and his gratitude. Later, Ted barged into Abel's house once again, but this time he started calling him master and asked to become his disciple once more. In response, Abel asked where that sudden talk of being a master had come from. Even so, from that day onward, he gradually became accustomed to Ted's presence and slowly adjusted to life in that world with Lilith by his side. The days passed peacefully. 2 years later, near Abel's house, Ted was practicing a fire spell known as Flaming Sphere and launched it at a target with steady control. Watching him, Abel noticed how much Ted had improved. Pleased with himself, Ted said that his progress would give him an advantage in the entrance examination the following day. He then excitedly asked whether Abel would be taking the Magic Academy exam alongside him. However, Abel turned to Lilith and asked whether taking the Academy exam was really necessary. After all, 2 centuries ago he had been known as a genius unlike any other. With that in mind, he looked at Lilith and questioned why he should attend an academy now. In response, she answered his question with one of her own and asked what he intended to do if he chose not to enroll. Abel replied that he planned to travel the world again as an adventurer. However, Lilith explained that the adventurer profession had been abolished 10 years earlier. In the past, adventurers hunted demons and sold their remains to the guild. But because the demon population had declined so dramatically, the profession had eventually become obsolete. Knowing that he still wished to pursue magic, she explained that doing so would be nearly impossible without graduating from an academy. Hearing that, Abel found it difficult to accept, since no one could teach him magic better than he had taught himself centuries earlier. Suddenly, Lilith asked whether he would rather rely on her instead, adding that she would be happy to support him. Faced with that suggestion, Abel asked her to stop and reluctantly agreed to take the examination. Later, at the academy gates, Abel tried to remain positive and viewed the experience as an opportunity to broaden his horizons. He had already arrived at Asura Academy, located in the capital of Midgeward. As they entered, he overheard several students commenting on the fact that his uniform lacked a family crest. Then someone remarked that he must be the student with inferior eyes they had heard rumors about and that the academy's standards must have declined. When he heard them saying that commoners belonged in the fields, Abel realized they were students based on the uniforms they wore. He also heard them claim that he had probably gained admission thanks to the donations of some wealthy family. They were convinced he had taken a shortcut. They confidently predicted that he would fail. Abel merely thought that the nobles still lacked refinement. On the other hand, Ted could not believe that people were judging someone based on eye color, although Abel knew Ted himself had once done exactly that. Suddenly, the two stopped when they heard someone scolding those students for their behavior. When they turned around, they saw a girl criticizing the group for insulting a commoner. She also stated that such conduct was disgraceful, even by noble standards. At that moment, Abel's attention was drawn to the crest on her uniform. It looked strangely familiar, although he could not remember where he had seen it before. Suddenly, one of the students rudely demanded to know who she was. The girl introduced herself as Melissa. She also declared that she would become a great mage, graduate at the top of the academy, and make her name known throughout the world. Finding her arrogant, they asked whether she was also taking the entrance examination and threatened to teach her some manners. However, Melissa remained perfectly calm. She then drew her sword and pointed it directly at them with unwavering resolve before asking who truly lacked manners. Shortly afterward, she ordered the men to get out of her sight immediately. When they noticed that their uniforms had already been sliced apart, they hurried away while warning her not to become too arrogant. She simply ignored them. As Abel watched her leave, he decided to thank her and called out to her. However, when he approached, she abruptly slapped his hand away. She then scolded him for daring to touch her, reminding him that he was nothing more than a commoner. Abel replied that he had only wanted to thank her, but she told him not to get the wrong idea and explained that she simply hated people who spoke badly about others behind their backs and had no intention of associating with commoners. Seeing that, Abel could not help wondering whether every student at that academy was like her. Suddenly, she stated that if he wanted her attention, he would first have to become stronger, and then she walked away. She added that she was interested only in the strong. Furious, Ted declared that she had no idea how powerful Abel really was. Although Abel had not expected to encounter a girl with such a forceful personality, there was something oddly familiar about her face. Later, the entrance examination began. The test consisted of 2 sections, a written portion and a practical portion, each worth 100 points, for a total of 200. The written exam covered general knowledge, magical language, and magical engineering. As he worked through the questions, Abel realized that the general knowledge section had barely changed in 200 years, and was far too easy to fail. The magical language section was even simpler, to the point that he yawned while answering it. However, the final portion on magical engineering proved far more demanding. When he reached the 12th question concerning God's final theorem, he noticed a dramatic increase in difficulty. He thought that achieving a perfect score might be difficult. Unfortunately for the exam creators, he was the very person who had established God's final theorem. Later in the academy courtyard, the examiner instructed the candidates to use their regalias for the practical test. She then told them to select a regalia that matched the color of their eyes. Seeing this, Ted was visibly excited. While Ted chose his own, Abel reflected on the instruction to pick one that corresponded to eye color. However, since there was no regalia designed for Zampar eyes, he selected a red one-handed sword instead. After that, the examiner explained that the practical test would measure the participants' magical power. The target was made from black matter that absorbed magic, so it would not break easily and allowed candidates to cast their strongest spells without restraint. She then asked who was prepared to begin, and Ted immediately volunteered. As soon as she approved, Ted stepped forward eagerly. However, Abel was concerned because, despite following Ted's progress, he knew his magical abilities were still at a beginner's level. Asura Academy gathered the finest talents from across the kingdom. Therefore, Abel hoped Ted would not embarrass himself in front of such a crowd. Soon the examiner gave the signal to start, and Ted raised his regalia and shouted, "Fireball!" A small sphere of flame shot from the weapon. Abel, however, was unimpressed. The spell was sloppy, exactly as he had expected. Ted was already clumsy by nature, and using an unfamiliar regalia only made matters worse. Even so, the fireball struck the target. At the sight of that, the examiner and the spectators were astonished. Meanwhile, Abel had expected Ted to be mocked, but instead the examiner described the result as remarkable. She even asked how someone so talented had entered through the standard admissions process, which left Abel confused. Suddenly, the other candidates began whispering that surpassing such an impressive spell would be difficult. That was when Abel realized that in this era, even a simple spell like Ted's was considered worthy of praise. Soon the remaining students took their turns, casting spells such as Windy Edge and Icy Needle. Watching them, Abel felt as though he were observing children at play. Finally, the examiner called the last name and asked whether Abel would take the test. Hearing that, he realized she also believed that people with Zampar eyes could barely use magic, and that her polite smile was merely a disguise for pity. Thinking about that, he wondered how much longer he would have to endure such treatment. At that moment, Ted shouted that Abel would be next and would demonstrate incredible magic. Although slightly surprised, Abel agreed. After stepping forward, he received the signal to begin from the examiner. As he stood there motionless, he started weighing his options. Suddenly, he decided to accept Ted's challenge, but in his own way. Meanwhile, Ted watched with excitement as the crowd focused its attention on Abel. Some people began whispering that he was taking so long because of the limitations of his eyes, unaware that Abel was maximizing the projectile speed of the spell, increasing its power output, and integrating a multi-shot formula. He also remembered that the target was made of black matter, so he activated limiter release. Then he quietly muttered, "Fireball, cutting rain." His regalia immediately radiated intense magical energy. A moment later, he launched the attack. The crowd was stunned by the enormous size of the spell, but Abel knew that its scale was only part of the story. In midair, the fireball split into dozens of smaller projectiles. Ted and the others were left utterly speechless. Soon afterward, the fireballs struck not only the targets but also the surrounding area. The spectators could hardly believe that the targets had been completely destroyed. Unlike the others, Ted loudly celebrated, thrilled by Abel's display. Meanwhile, Abel realized that he had overdone it, since the entire testing area had been transformed into a devastated wasteland. Even so, he felt satisfied because that demonstration might finally put an end to the prejudice surrounding Zampar eyes. Elsewhere in another section of the examination grounds, Melissa swung her sword while casting a spell called Flame Blade. Her attack struck the target with tremendous force, causing visible cracks to spread across its surface. The examiner and the surrounding candidates were shocked to see black matter damaged in such a way. Even so, Melissa did not seem impressed. She questioned whether the Academy's facilities were truly of a high standard, since everyone appeared so easily amazed. Suddenly, she noticed another examiner approaching Professor Fidelia. Abel sharpened her hearing and overheard a conversation about a black matter target that had been destroyed by a candidate with Zampar eyes. Hearing that, she was visibly surprised and immediately thought about the Zampar-eyed candidate. She wondered if they were referring to the commoner she had met earlier. A slow smile spread across her face as she realized things were becoming interesting. Meanwhile, Ted strode proudly through the hallway, delighted that he had achieved the same score as Abel. He kept bragging about it, but Abel knew their scores matched only because they had both reached the maximum possible mark. Soon, Ted brought him to the waiting room reserved for candidates with perfect scores. Inside, the other examiners were already seated. The moment Abel entered, everyone noticed him. Whispers quickly spread through the room, identifying him as the one who had destroyed the black matter target. Suddenly, someone called out to Abel, It was Melissa, asking whether he had truly destroyed the target during the practical exam. While Abel tried to remember whether she was the same girl from before, Ted recognized her immediately. Melissa continued by asking how he had managed to create such a powerful spell. She also remarked that Zampar eyes possessed no natural elemental affinity, and asked whether he had trained under some famous mage. Abel offered no response. Annoyed, she warned him that his true abilities would be exposed in the next examination. Ted immediately scolded her for her arrogance. At that moment, Professor Fidelia entered the room and instructed everyone to take their seats. She then explained the details of the final test, which would take the form of a duel. Hearing that, Abel realized this was what Melissa had been referring to earlier. The professor went on to explain that every match would be a one-on-one battle. The loser would be the first person whose academy-issued protective barrier was shattered. The matchups would be determined according to the practical exam results, pairing students of comparable strength. As expected, the first duel would be Abel versus Melissa. While Ted cheered from the sidelines, Abel calmly accepted the unavoidable match. Melissa wasted no time and ordered him to draw his weapon. Noticing her enthusiasm, Abel concluded that nobles of this era truly enjoyed duels. He stated that he would not be using a weapon because he lacked combat experience with Regalius. Upon hearing that, Melissa understood that he intended to fight using conventional magic. Even so, she drew her sword and charged forward, demanding that he show his real strength. As she rushed toward him, Abel realized that she was fast. That surprised him because despite the overall decline in magical skill over the centuries, someone like her still existed. In response, he reinforced his body with magic and effortlessly evaded her attack. Melissa was startled by his speed. Meanwhile, Ted continued cheering enthusiastically. Growing more serious, Melissa cloaked her sword in flames. She then struck with Flame Blade. Seeing the attack approaching, Abel responded by casting his own version of Flame Blade. An even larger wave of fire surged toward Melissa. She was clearly shocked by what she saw. Moments later, the two attacks collided and triggered a massive explosion. Ted was astonished to witness the spells crashing into each other. When the dust finally settled, the previously pristine arena had been reduced to ruins. At the center of the destruction, Abel remained standing without moving. He glanced around and realized that Melissa had disappeared. He wondered whether he had overdone it. Suddenly, she emerged from the smoke. The moment he saw her, Abel realized that she had concealed her presence the entire time, while advancing for a surprise attack. He acknowledged that the tactic was clever, but she had simply chosen the wrong opponent. Without hesitation, he gathered magic in his hand and cast Flaming Bullet. When Melissa saw the attack, she noticed that it consisted of 12 fire projectiles. She was also surprised by the spell's speed and finally admitted to herself that he was genuinely powerful. Soon, the fire bullets struck simultaneously, covering the arena in a dense cloud of smoke. Watching from the sidelines, Ted commented on the enormous gap between their levels. However, Abel remained completely unfazed. What surprised him most was that Melissa still appeared ready to continue fighting despite taking such a powerful attack. Suddenly, Professor Fidelia announced that the protective barrier had been broken, meaning the duel was over. However, Melissa refused to accept the result. She said that the examination results could already be decided, but she still wanted to continue. Seeing that, Abel thought she was an incredibly stubborn person who was not even fighting for the sake of the exam anymore. When she raised her sword once again, he sensed her determination to prove her strength according to her own beliefs. Melissa declared that she would prove she was strong. Seeing that, Abel asked why she was so obsessed with strength during an age of peace. Unlike 200 years ago, people no longer needed power simply to survive. Melissa immediately disagreed, arguing that the peace they enjoyed was nothing more than an illusion. Furthermore, she believed that an entire century without conflict was simply too good to be true. For that reason, she argued that treaties could never guarantee lasting peace, and that the reincarnation of the Demon King's soul remained a threat. She also pointed out that the neighboring nation of Kedia had been quietly strengthening its military, and that monsters might still be lurking elsewhere. Because of that, she refused to grow complacent in what she considered a false peace, and was determined to become stronger. Throwing her sword aside, she shouted that she would also rebuild the house that had raised her. In response, Abel turned to look at her. Melissa then began channeling her flame-based physical enhancement magic, and wrapped herself in fire. As Ted and the others watched in awe, her body became covered in armor made of blazing flames. Afterward, she invoked forbidden magic and summoned the sky of rose matter. Soon, the flames swirling around her transformed into a pair of wings. At the sight of that, Abel was left speechless. Ted could hardly believe his eyes as Melissa hovered in the air and once again declared that Abel should prepare himself because she intended to win. But Abel simply watched in silence. As Melissa floated overhead, Ted wondered whether this was flight magic, something he had always believed existed only in legends. Seeing it, Abel recalled that flight magic required extraordinarily precise control over multiple magical attributes and was extremely dangerous to perform incorrectly. Even in his own era, only a handful of people had been capable of mastering it. For someone like Melissa, who possessed ruby eyes, using such a technique must have required tremendous effort. As he observed her, Abel was reminded of a red-haired girl from the distant past, who might have passed that magic down through her lineage. Suddenly, Melissa asked whether he had never witnessed anything like it before, but Abel replied that the opposite was true. While casting a spell, he remarked that the magic revealed the origins of her family. He also admitted that he had not expected a unique spell from 2 centuries ago to survive almost completely unchanged. Looking at her, he concluded that her stubborn ancestors had preserved a technique that consumed life force in exchange for its activation. The moment he finished his analysis, he unleashed his counterspell. The spell struck Melissa directly, and although she attempted to evade it, the attack moved too quickly. After neutralizing her magic through careful analysis and the proper response, it became obvious how great an advantage prior knowledge of a technique could be. As a result, Melissa's wings vanished. A few moments later, she began falling. Abel immediately leaped upward and caught her before she could hit the ground. While holding her, he remarked that she was a descendant of Maria, the heroine of fire. Melissa looked bewildered once they landed. He told her that she was impressive, just like Maria had been, and encouraged her to continue improving. Shortly afterward, Professor Fidelia announced that Abel was the winner. At that, Ted celebrated enthusiastically along with the rest of the crowd. When Abel left the arena, people began praising him from all sides. Meanwhile, Melissa sat on the ground in disbelief, and as she lay there, she could not stop herself from crying while wondering what exactly made Abel so different from everyone else. Later, several professors at the academy gathered to discuss the candidates. They praised Ted, Melissa, and Abel, describing all three as prodigies capable of raising the academy's standards. However, one professor stopped what he was doing when he heard that. The professor, named Emergio, disagreed and stated that calling all three geniuses was absurd and misleading. In his opinion, there was only one true genius among them, and that was Abel. Another professor replied that Abel's magic was exceptional, but Melissa possessed comparable strength. Hearing that, Emergio remained unimpressed and thought the other professors needed to relearn the fundamentals. He explained that Abel's brilliance extended far beyond magic alone. That was because Abel had also solved God's final theorem, leaving everyone stunned. Ordinarily, the problem was so difficult that magical scholars still struggled to fully understand it. Yet Abel had not only solved it but improved upon it as well, an accomplishment worthy of national recognition. The other professors were completely shocked by this revelation. At that moment, the academy director arrived and commented on the commotion coming from the faculty room. Emergio then praised the talent of the Zamparide candidate, something the director readily accepted since the statement came from Emergio himself. He then declared that Abel could one day become the greatest mage in the nation. However, the moment he mentioned Abel's name, the director reacted with shock. As a result, his dentures fell straight to the floor. Seeing that, one of the professors hurried over to assist him. While picking up the dentures, the director asked Emergio to repeat the student's name. Emergio confirmed once again that the student's name was Abel. He also mentioned that Abel had earned perfect scores and proclaimed him the academy's greatest genius. After hearing that, the director finally confirmed that the name truly was Abel. Later that night, inside the academy, he still could not stop thinking about that name. So he made his way to a secret chamber guarded by a knight statue. Using magic, he cast a spell on the statue's sword. In response, a hidden door behind it slowly opened. Beyond it stood another door, which he quickly passed through. As soon as he entered, the door closed behind him. He then approached a nearby cabinet and opened it, remembering that he had stored something important there. Soon, a sealed letter appeared before him. He untied the cord and opened it immediately. Inside was a message intended for Roy's descendants. The letter contained a truth meant only for that bloodline. It explained that Roy, along with the fire, wind, water, and ash sorcerers, had become known as the Four Sages who defeated the Demon Lord. However, that story was a lie, because none of them had actually managed to wound him. The one who had truly defeated him was not part of that group but rather a Zamparide mage named Abel. The letter stated that this truth would likely be lost to history. Even so, the director had heard the tale countless times from his late grandfather. The story spoke of a forgotten fifth figure among the so-called four great heroes. That man possessed Zampar eyes, just like the demons. Despite his immense power, he suffered persecution and was erased from the historical record. Even so, the director found it difficult to believe that anyone could survive for 200 years. On the other hand, dismissing the matter as a simple coincidence also seemed unwise. For that reason, he decided to personally evaluate Abel's abilities. The following day, Abel was calmly enjoying a drink at a cafe in the capital. Suddenly, Ted burst through the door, excitedly announcing that the results had finally been released. He proudly showed Abel that he had passed. Then he offered Abel his own results and asked whether he wanted to see them. But Abel replied that there was no need, since he already knew he had passed. Ted looked confused and pointed out that the envelope had already been opened and that he had looked inside before Abel. Embarrassed, Ted admitted that he had peeked at Abel's torn-open results letter, and Abel replied that Ted would never hear from him again. Changing the subject, Abel closed his book and asked about the person standing behind Ted. At that, Elisa awkwardly tried to hide, though her head remained completely visible. She then stepped forward and pretended she had only just recognized them from the previous day. Claiming the encounter was pure coincidence, she was immediately exposed by Ted, who asked whether she had come there for tea. Elisa answered that she simply liked the cafe's cupcakes. Abel could tell it was a weak excuse and realized she had followed Ted there. So he bluntly asked her to stop pretending and explain the real reason. Elisa hesitated before saying it was not for any particular reason. In truth, she was curious about which class Abel had been assigned to. She also admitted that she had a great deal to learn from him and wanted to push herself as far as possible. Abel was not entirely sure what she meant by that. Before he could respond, Ted volunteered to reveal the information since the class assignments would soon be public anyway. Proudly, he announced that both he and Abel had been placed in Class A and said he hoped Elisa would be there too. Abel, however, saw no particular importance in whether they shared the same class. Even so, Elisa looked delighted by the news. After that, she left the cafe in an unusually cheerful mood. Meanwhile, Abel found himself wondering what had just happened. Ted guessed that she was simply nervous because she did not have many friends. Their discussion was interrupted when another person arrived. The moment they saw who it was, both Abel and Ted were visibly startled. It was Lilith, though she was dressed in an entirely different outfit. Noticing this immediately, Abel asked about her new clothing. She explained that she had just been appointed as a teacher at Asura Academy. Ted was astonished and thought the coincidence was incredibly strange. Abel, on the other hand, was not surprised in the slightest. He understood Lilith's determination and knew that her long lifespan gave her advantages few others possessed. Suddenly, Lilith leaned close and quietly told Abel that she would now be supporting him as one of the Academy's instructors. On the day before the entrance ceremony, Lilith escorted Abel and Ted to the student dormitories. When they arrived, both were impressed by the sheer size of the place. Lilith explained that the Academy followed a 5-year program, and that every student lived on campus. After giving them the essential information, she left to attend to her duties as a newly appointed teacher. Abel thanked her, while Ted said he looked forward to seeing her again the next day. As they carried their belongings, Abel noticed that Ted seemed to be struggling. He remarked that Ted probably should have packed less luggage. Ted had no excuse to offer. At that moment, a woman approached and recognized them as incoming students. She introduced herself as Fidelia, the instructor responsible for the first-year dormitory. Abel recognized her from the entrance examination, while Ted was surprised to learn that she was actually a teacher. Fidelia checked their names and handed them their academy uniforms. She also reminded them that casual clothes were allowed inside the dormitory, but academy uniforms were mandatory elsewhere. The instant he received his uniform, Abel noticed that it had been enchanted. Fidelia confirmed this and explained that the enchantments provided resistance against magic and dirt. Curious, Abel asked who had crafted the enchantments, and she answered that it was likely done by a specialist hired by the academy. After receiving their room keys, they were informed that the remainder of the day was free before the entrance ceremony. With that settled, Abel and Ted headed to their respective rooms. Once inside, Abel continued carefully examining the uniform. Seeing this, Ted asked whether he was really that interested in it. Abel explained that enchanting items was traditionally the specialty of black-eyed mages, who excelled at improving the properties of objects such as uniforms. However, he judged the enchantments on the uniform to be only third-rate and a waste of high-quality materials. Because of that, he decided to redo the enchantments himself. With that in mind, he asked Ted to hand over his uniform as well. After modifying the enchantments, Ted tried the uniform on again and immediately noticed that it felt much lighter. Seeing the result, Abel concluded that the base materials were excellent, which made the improvements easier to implement. He then began working on his own uniform. At that moment, Ted gathered his belongings and proudly announced that he was about to begin his manju diplomacy. Abel looked puzzled until Ted revealed a box filled with Langard's local specialty, snowball manju. Only then did Abel finally understand why Ted had brought so much luggage. After taking a bite himself, Ted insisted that Abel try one too. Abel remarked that he had lived in Langard for more than 2 years, and that the supposedly famous sweet was merely average. Nevertheless, Ted remained determined to hand them out to the neighboring students. After all, his goal was to make 100 friends. With that declaration, he immediately left the room. Watching him go, Abel thought that Ted might actually succeed in making 100 friends. As for himself, he simply wanted to graduate peacefully without getting involved in any trouble. Setting those thoughts aside, he returned to improving the enchantments on his own uniform. Once the work was finished, he decided to take a nap since the magical adjustments had left him tired. Before he could rest, however, he heard shouting coming from outside. When he looked through the window, he saw several students confronting Ted. One of them demanded to know whether Ted was trying to insult them. Ted explained that he had only been attempting to make friends. Watching the scene, Abel wondered whether Ted's manju diplomacy had failed. Suddenly, another student shouted that Ted could keep dreaming because nobody would ever want to be friends with someone like him, especially a poisonous perch. Hearing that, Abel wondered what exactly they meant, though he vaguely remembered reading about something similar in a book. Poisonous perch was the name given to an invasive freshwater fish species that had multiplied rapidly throughout the rivers of urban areas. Its rapid reproduction and feeding habits were damaging the balance of the aquatic ecosystem. Meanwhile, Ted kept rummaging through his backpack and once again urged everyone to try the specialty from his hometown. However, one of the students slapped his hand away, knocking the sweet onto the ground and telling him to shut up. Even with the food scattered across the floor, they continued mocking Ted by calling him a poisonous perch. Ted stared at the fallen manju with a disappointed expression. Watching the scene unfold, Abel found their behavior cruel and wondered whether those students had never been taught not to waste food. He considered stepping in, but before Ted could pick up the dropped sweet, someone else approached. It was Elisa. She picked up one of the manju from the floor and ate it right in front of everyone. Ted and the other students were left completely stunned. She, however, showed no concern and gave the sweet a score of 70. She also remarked that it was not bad, though it could have benefited from a stronger local flavor. Seeing that, the bullies were horrified and insisted that poisonous perches were disgusting, especially after she had eaten something off the ground. Elisa turned toward them and calmly asked what they had just said. Meanwhile, Abel began to worry because he had no idea what Elisa was about to do next. So he stepped in and told everyone to stop. One of the bullies demanded to know who he was. Before Abel could answer, Ted said he did not care about what had happened. He also thanked Elisa, but she asked whether he had no pride at all. Ted replied that the issue was not about pride at that moment. Abel then started to understand the discrimination that existed among the nobles. As Lilith had explained, the academy accepted both students from its preparatory school and outside applicants who passed the public entrance examination. Now he realized that poisonous perch was probably a slur aimed at external students like them. Suddenly, the bullies heard Ted call Abel his master and began wondering whether the amber-eyed boy they had seen earlier was the same master he always talked about. However, they insisted that someone with eyes like those could never be a master. Seeing this, Elisa ordered them to stop. Ted also shouted that they should not insult his master. At that moment, Elisa, the bullies, and even Abel were left speechless. Without warning, Ted grabbed one of the bullies by the collar and demanded an apology. The leader of the group ordered him to let go and called him disgusting. At that moment, Ted remembered how he had once mocked Abel's eyes in the past. He had even called them chick eyes. Recalling that memory filled him with frustration toward himself. Even so, he stood his ground and continued calling Abel his master. Confused, Abel waited to hear what Ted would say next. Meanwhile, the leader of the bullies kept ordering Ted to release him. Another student tried pulling Ted back, but he would not budge. That was when Abel and Elisa noticed something unusual. Suddenly, the section of Ted's uniform being grabbed began to glow. An instant later, a burst of magical force erupted, startling Elisa. The leader of the bullies and his companions were thrown to the ground, dazed and confused. The leader demanded to know what had just happened, but Ted seemed equally clueless. Meanwhile, Abel immediately realized that the enchantment he had placed on Ted's uniform had activated. It was a simple reflection spell designed to trigger only when the wearer suffered a physical attack. Apparently, it had worked perfectly, and the timing could not have been better. As a result, the bullies began backing away, though they warned that they would remember this. Abel knew Ted had handled the situation well and that things could have ended much worse for them. Meanwhile, Ted was still standing there in shock. Soon afterward, he turned to Abel and said the bullies had been sent flying even though he had done nothing. He then started wondering whether he had finally awakened some hidden power. Abel doubted that possibility, since none of the students present, including Ted, possessed particularly great strength. Suddenly, Elisa grabbed Ted's arm and began inspecting his uniform. After examining it, she was astonished by the quality of the enchantment, unlike anything she had ever seen before. Proudly, Ted declared that Abel had made it himself and that he was incredibly skilled with enchantment magic. Abel quickly tried to silence him and warned him not to say unnecessary things. Elisa was clearly shocked to learn that Abel had created the enchantment. At that moment, Abel began dragging Ted away, and Elisa attempted to stop them. Even then, she still doubted that Abel had truly crafted the enchantment, because the magic woven into the uniform was extraordinarily sophisticated. As they walked away, Ted asked whether Abel was shy, but Abel simply told him to be quiet. Elisa remained behind, struggling with mixed emotions. A moment later, she remembered that she had originally come to invite them on a tour of the dormitory, but she had completely forgotten to mention it. The following day, inside the academy, Abel and Ted could be seen running down a corridor. As they hurried along, Abel remarked that they were already late for the entrance ceremony. Ted apologized, explaining that he had slept poorly because of the unfamiliar pillows. Abel simply replied that he was far too delicate. Eventually, they arrived in front of a massive door. Abel immediately began studying it with great attention. Ted noticed and asked what was wrong. Without warning, Abel raised a hand and examined the door, which was embedded with magical formulas. After analyzing its structure, he realized it was a welcome enchantment prepared for incoming students. He then stepped aside and told Ted to go in first after opening the door. Ted hesitated and began speculating that perhaps the door shocked students who arrived late. Abel merely replied that he would understand the moment he entered. Ted quickly said that he was not mentally prepared yet. Even so, Abel shoved him forward. The instant Ted crossed the threshold, a series of magical dolls activated. Ted was stunned when music suddenly began playing. Meanwhile, Abel thought whoever had designed it must have had rather unusual taste. The dolls kept performing their tune, and some of them even started dancing as part of the display. Perplexed, Ted asked what was going on. Abel calmly explained that it was merely a basic enchantment that triggered a mechanism whenever it detected the magical energy of whoever opened the door. As the performance continued, every student's attention shifted toward Ted. Although he was still trying to process what had happened, he overheard people saying he had activated the Rare Knight's March and calling him a prodigy. Meanwhile, Elisa watched everything without saying a word. Abel, on the other hand, admired the design and thought it was a refined way to welcome new magicians. Nearby, several students praised Ted and assumed Abel was merely his attendant because of his eyes. At the same time, some teachers were impressed by Ted's display and remarked that Emergi should have witnessed it. Even after Abel's explanation, Ted was still trying to figure out how the whole thing worked. Suddenly, the headmaster appeared and remarked that he was pleased to hear the Knight's March being played that year. Afterward, he introduced himself as Mick Rail, the principal of Asura Academy. He then began offering congratulations to the incoming students. Meanwhile, Abel took a seat and silently observed the hall. From what he could tell, each year appeared to have around 200 students. Out of nowhere, Ted leaned closer and asked whether Abel knew who the headmaster was. He then revealed that Headmaster Mick Rail was a descendant of Roy, the hero of Wind. Hearing Roy's name, Abel realized it had been an incredibly long time since he had last heard it. 200 years earlier, Roy had been one of his companions during the campaign against the Demon Lord. To Abel, Roy had been like a younger brother. The memory left him feeling somewhat melancholy. A moment later, Ted said the information had been written in the academy pamphlet, though he admitted he had neither read it nor cared about it. After that, the headmaster continued his lengthy speech. During his address, he outlined the academy's policies and introduced the newly appointed instructors. However, Abel found the entire presentation dull and unnecessary. Once the ceremony ended, Abel and Ted began searching for Class A's assigned classroom as they walked through the academy. Ted commented that Abel seemed distracted. Abel denied it, but his expression shifted when he suddenly sensed something unusual. Noticing this, Ted asked what was wrong. Abel turned around and felt an unfamiliar gaze fixed on him. However, it was not coming from a person but from a regalia. Realizing this, he briefly wondered whether someone had uncovered his true identity, but the energy felt far too weak to belong to a human. He therefore concluded that someone was spying through a regalia. Meanwhile, inside the classroom, a student asked the leader of the bullies whether Ted had really been the one who defeated him. The question irritated him immediately. Even so, he denied it, and explained that it had been the enchantment that sent them flying, though the girl refused to believe him. Nearby, Elisa listened to the conversation and also brought up the magical doors Ted had activated. At that moment, Ted entered the classroom. As a result, the entire room fell silent. Sensing the sudden change in atmosphere, Ted became uncomfortable, but Abel told him that such reactions were perfectly normal. Across the room, Emerson and the other bullies continued staring at the pair. Not long afterward, another person entered the classroom. The girl seated beside Elisa looked surprised, and after the man placed his book on the desk and yawned, she exclaimed that he was Professor Emerson. Seeing her reaction, he confirmed that she was correct. Ted was equally shocked to see him. Abel asked whether Emerson was famous, and Ted immediately nodded. Ted explained that Emerson was an executive candidate of Kronos, and the strongest mage of the modern era. Hearing that, Abel remembered that Emerson's name appeared frequently in contemporary books on magical engineering. After observing him more carefully, he admitted that Emerson did indeed seem competent by the standards of this age. Suddenly, Ted mentioned that Emerson had been the creator of the magical engineering section of the entrance examination. That explained why the test had been so difficult. After a while, Emerson skipped attendance entirely and introduced himself as the homeroom teacher. Abel noticed that Emerson's hair was messy and his shirt was untucked, giving him a rather careless appearance. Even so, Abel thought that exceptionally talented mages often had eccentric habits. Suddenly, a student asked whether it was true that Emerson was usually too absorbed in research to bother teaching. Emerson admitted that he focused far more on research and only maintained his teaching position because it helped secure government funding. Hearing that, the girl asked why he had agreed to become their homeroom teacher. In response, he revealed that there was something in that class he wanted to investigate personally. As he spoke, his eyes settled directly on Abel. Abel noticed the stare and realized it was the same one he had felt earlier. However, Emerson added that his reason was a secret, and Abel offered no reply. After that, Abel's school life began in earnest. He attended classes during the day. After school, he spent time reading in the library before returning to the dormitory to bathe. He would then spend the evening reading again until it was time to sleep. Occasionally, he exchanged a few brief words with Lilith, and together these habits formed a peaceful routine. The real problem, however, was the classes themselves. He found them unbearably tedious. By contrast, Ted clearly struggled to keep up with the advanced material. As for Abel, he regarded most lessons as pointless and used the time to pursue his own research. After all he needed to make progress was paper and a pen. But at that moment, the teacher noticed that his attention had wandered and called him up to solve a problem on the board. Deep down, the teacher viewed his amber eyes as inferior and considered it arrogant that he was ignoring the lesson. Realizing he had been caught not paying attention, Abel stood up anyway, recognizing it as little more than an attempt to embarrass him in front of the class. As he walked to the board, he quickly reviewed the teacher's rushed explanation and remarked that his approach might differ. He then began writing on the board. He arranged the solution in a way that would be easier for the students to follow. Afterward, he demonstrated how the magical formula could be simplified through several shortcuts. Seeing this, both the teacher and the students were visibly astonished. Meanwhile, Abel admitted that he had not been listening, but added that he preferred lessons that genuinely helped students understand the material. The teacher clenched his jaw as he praised Abel and told him to return to his seat. As Abel turned around to go back, someone quietly muttered the word show off. That person disliked both Ted and Abel, believing that studying was meaningless without magical talent. Even so, Abel simply sat back down and paid no attention to the remark. Afterward, he headed to one of the Academy's 5 libraries. The main library held an enormous collection of books, but it was always crowded. Because of that, he only borrowed books from there. He would then read them in the smaller libraries instead. At that moment, someone called out to him. Looking up, he saw Elisa, who mentioned that he studied there as well. Abel was somewhat surprised to find her in the library, but she explained that she could focus better there. She then asked about his homework, and he casually replied that he usually finished it quickly in his room. After that, the two continued studying in silence. Suddenly, Elisa stopped writing and was clearly struggling with something. Abel then suggested that she divide the problem into 2 separate formulas. Seeing that he had returned to reading, she remained quiet. After some time, she called to him again, showed him her notebook, and asked whether her solution was correct. After checking it, Abel realized that she learned faster and understood things better than Ted. Later, outside, Elisa thanked him for the explanation and said it had been easy to follow. She then asked whether he always spent his free time reading in the library. That prompted Abel to ask whether she found it strange. She replied that she did not. Even so, she wondered whether he ever went out anywhere. After all, they lived in a city filled with things that could not be found inside the academy. She then began listing restaurants, fruits, and sweets. Abel pointed out that everything she had mentioned was food. In response, she quickly added places such as secondhand bookstores, which immediately caught his interest. Noticing that reaction, Elisa explained that those shops often carried rare books at low prices. Hearing that, Abel realized he would genuinely enjoy visiting bookstores from this era. She then invited him to go out on a day off as a way of thanking him for helping her. Abel replied that he had no objections. That answer brought a smile to her face. However, someone interrupted them at that moment. Nearby, the bullies mocked Abel for getting along so well with Elisa. Recognizing them, Abel calmly asked whether they needed something. However, the group's leader told him not to act superior when he was merely an external student. He then questioned how someone with inferior eyes had been accepted at all, implying that bribery must have been involved. With that in mind, the leader suggested that Abel retake the entrance examination. After all, he felt confident since Ted was not there to protect him. Meanwhile, Elisa looked surprised when the bully drew out his regalia. Abel, however, remained calm and asked why they hated external students so much. Hearing that, the leader became furious and shouted that external students were not equal to them, even if they had passed the same exam. According to him, internal students had spent years studying, while outsiders simply appeared and behaved as though they belonged there. The thought made him furious. However, Abel realized that their anger was rooted in pride. So he agreed to the challenge but first dropped his bag to the ground and walked past them, mocking the poor equipment they used in battle. Seeing this, the leader was shocked to discover that his regalia had vanished, along with everyone else's. Elisa was equally surprised and asked when Abel had taken them. Abel inspected the regalias and asked whether they ever bothered maintaining them. He also remarked that the materials had deteriorated badly, creating magical distortions. Afterward, he handed the regalias back and advised them to take better care of their equipment if they wanted to become mages. Once the leader retrieved his regalia, Abel asked Elisa to pick up his bag so they could leave. Meanwhile, the leader stood there trembling with frustration. He gripped his regalia tightly and shouted that Abel should not get so full of himself. He then declared that he would humiliate him. He also warned Abel to pay close attention during the following day's class. Seeing that reaction, Abel remained silent, wondering whether they were still planning something. The next day, Ted was overflowing with excitement because it was finally the day of physical training. Watching him, Abel thought Ted was being a bit excessive, though he understood the enthusiasm. After all, physical training classes were held only once each week. Suddenly, someone arrived and announced that everyone had gathered. He introduced himself as Cantor, the physical education instructor, and remarked that students from the preparatory division might already know him. After that, he announced that they would be playing Huns, which excited most of the class. Ted, however, had no idea what that meant. Cantor then began explaining the rules of the Hunter game, but the leader of the bullies interrupted, saying they already knew how it worked. In response, Cantor replied that they did not fully understand the game. He then explained that the class would be adjusted so that even students unfamiliar with it, or those unable to participate normally, could still understand the rules. Hearing that, the leader commented that external students always required extra effort. Both Ted and Elisa looked surprised by the remark. Even so, Elisa remained unconcerned and declared that external students like them would defeat the others. But Ted asked her to simply enjoy the class. While Abel knew that dealing with defeat later would be much harder for him, Cantor announced that he would divide the students into teams by calling out names. As the others quickly formed groups, Abel waited patiently. Eventually, his team was assigned. Meanwhile, Ted was delighted to find himself on the same team as Abel. However, Elisa called Ted and Abel careless, which left him confused. After she confirmed that he truly had not noticed, Abel realized that Team D consisted entirely of external students. It seemed they had been singled out, which finally made Ted understand. Suddenly, one girl admitted that she was bad at sports, while the boy with glasses said he preferred intellectual activities. The other two claimed they were decent enough, though Abel had his doubts. Even so, Elisa assured them she would support the team, but the girl remarked that the internal students seemed to look down on them. In response, Elisa stated that nobody would be able to cheat, so they would compete fairly and prove everyone wrong. While the group tried to stay positive, Abel suspected their opponents might not play honestly. Suddenly, the leader of the bullies whispered for him to enjoy the game. He also promised to make up for what had happened the previous day. Hearing that, Abel noticed Cantor smiling nearby as well. That made him suspect that even the teacher was involved. After some time, Cantor announced the match between Team B and Team D. He explained that in Hunter, Team B would act as the shooters, consisting of 3 players, the bullies themselves. Meanwhile, Team D would play the role of the rabbits. Each side would have 5 minutes to attack during its turn. The shooters would use a glove-shaped regalia capable of firing projectiles at the rabbits. There were 3 types of projectiles: the spear type, which was the fastest, the balanced sphere type, and the disc type, which was easier to control. The shooter's objective was to hit the rabbits and knock them out. The rabbits' goal was simply to avoid being struck. Whichever team had the most surviving members would win. After hearing the rules, Ted realized it was similar to Kimata, except the players were divided into attackers and defenders. Meanwhile, Abel watched Ted dodge a shot fired from behind and was not surprised by his agility. He also suspected that Ted had reacted to the air vibrations caused by the projectile. Shortly afterward, the boy with glasses was hit. Seeing that, Abel realized he was out of the game. As he continued dodging, Abel reflected that attributeless magic might be weaker and non-lethal, but it was still magic nonetheless. Watching Ted use magic defensively and Elisa skillfully evade the incoming attacks, he realized that even training projectiles still carried a noticeable impact. Suddenly, Abel saw two projectiles heading straight toward him. He found it strange that the bullies were attacking so directly, but halfway through their path, the shots abruptly changed direction. Abel was caught off guard, and as the projectiles continued moving, they ended up striking two of his teammates. Elisa was alarmed when she saw them collapse. However, Abel immediately understood what the opposing team was doing. As expected, the leader of the bullies gave him a mocking look. Meanwhile, Elisa began confronting them. She accused them of cheating. Seeing that, Abel realized she had noticed it as well. He understood that attributeless magic contained target tracking syntax, which meant the shock gloves had been illegally modified. However, the bullies told Elisa to stop talking nonsense and even called her fat. Furious, she demanded that they repeat what they had said. Abel urged her not to lose her composure while they continued avoiding the attacks. He explained that distracting opponents with words was a basic battlefield tactic. Furthermore, projectiles were still coming from the sides, so she needed to stay focused. Hearing that, she shyly thanked him just as the attacks resumed. Abel then began noticing a few interesting members on his team. One of the girls warned Elisa to look behind her, allowing her to dodge in time. At the same moment, Elisa thanked the girl named Yukarok. Yukarok replied that Elisa had done well too. Looking at her, Abel remarked that Yukarok had seemed timid at first, but was now making a genuine effort. She also warned Ted about incoming attacks, demonstrating composure and excellent awareness of the battlefield. Even though her physical abilities were lacking, Abel thought that if she gained more confidence, she could become an excellent mage. However, Abel soon noticed something else. He saw the bullies begin concentrating all of their shots on Yukarok. As a result, she was struck in the back and immediately fell. Ted and Elisa became worried. Meanwhile, Abel realized that the bullies had deliberately targeted the team's observer as part of their strategy. With that, the leader called Yukarok a burden and pointed at her again, saying that slow players should leave the field. Yukarok began to cry, and when she turned around, she was struck once more. Seeing that, Elisa and Ted were shocked. Enraged, Elisa questioned their behavior, but the bullies asked what exactly she meant. Even so, they kept firing while insisting they were simply eliminating a weak player. Seeing this, Ted tried to stop them, but Yukarok had already been hit again and was groaning in pain. When Ted tried to move closer, Elisa stepped in front of Yukarok and demanded that they stop, pointing out that Yukarok had already been eliminated. She also argued that attacking someone who was already down was unacceptable, but the leader denied that she had been knocked out. Because of that, they kept firing, insisting that she was still an active player. With her attention diverted, Elisa left herself exposed and was struck as well. Seeing Elisa go down, Ted shouted her name. Meanwhile, Abel noticed that one of Elisa's weaknesses was allowing her emotions to control her actions. Suddenly, Ted raised his hand to get the instructor's attention. He protested that the hit should not count, but before anything could be done, he was struck too. As he fell, Elisa called out to him. Watching the scene unfold, Abel quietly remarked that people often end up suffering from the very things they try to do to others. At that moment, the bully leader declared that outside students were worthless and should return to wherever they had come from. Hearing that, both Elisa and Ted burned with anger, while Yukarok continued crying. Yet only a short time had passed since the match began, and now only a single player remained. That player was Abel. Realizing this, the bullies prepared themselves. The leader asked how they should deal with him, but Abel merely stared back in silence. Even so, the leader shouted for them to crush the last poisonous fish. The other bullies immediately joined the assault on Abel. For a moment, Abel considered whether it would be less troublesome to simply let them win. However, since things had already gone this far, he decided not to stand idle and began dodging. After avoiding several attacks, the leader unleashed a rapid barrage, but Abel slipped past every shot. Seeing that, Ted and the others began cheering for him. The leader only laughed as he continued firing at Abel. He claimed Abel must already be exhausted, but in reality, Abel was perfectly fine, while the bullies themselves were beginning to tire. Suddenly, someone announced that only 1 minute remained. Realizing the time limit was approaching, the leader understood that a different approach was needed. The bullies then launched a coordinated attack. Looking upward, Abel saw a rain of projectiles descending toward him. Meanwhile, Elisa and Ted looked visibly worried. Abel quickly realized that the bullies had added a dispersal syntax to the projectiles. They were cheating once again. Even so, the leader was convinced that Abel would be unable to evade this attack. Abel knew he could avoid it, but doing so would attract too much attention. So he decided to bend the rules as well, since they had started it first. Immediately, he activated his magic, authorized the spell, and quietly uttered a counter-magic incantation. A protective barrier suddenly appeared around him. He even pretended to struggle a little, so that it would not seem suspicious. The outcome left everyone confused, including the bullies. Despite the overwhelming barrage, Abel remained completely unharmed. Soon afterward, the leader realized that his regalia seemed to have malfunctioned. Not long later, Team B's attack phase came to an end. Ted and the others began praising Abel for handling the entire situation by himself. However, Ted quickly started asking questions again. Abel immediately told him to be quiet. He was the only survivor, and they would need to defeat their opponents during the next round or they would lose. Even so, Ted remained convinced that victory was still possible. Just as Abel had endured, Elisa was eager to finally demonstrate what she could really do. Hearing that, Abel thought it would be ideal if the two of them could defeat the opposing team themselves. The bullies, however, mocked their enthusiasm and promised to crush them. After hearing those threats, Abel suspected they had another scheme prepared. Soon, Cantor announced the start of the next round. The bully leader instantly shouted for everyone to take formation. In response, his team arranged themselves into a defensive formation. Seeing this, Ted snorted and remarked that they had only made themselves easier targets. Agreeing with him, Elisa confidently declared that she would wipe them all out at once. As attacks began approaching, one bully warned of a spear-type projectile coming from the northwest. Another reported a disc-type attack approaching from the southeast. Watching everyone dodge successfully, Abel finally understood their strategy. They were using every team member to monitor a different direction. By constantly sharing information, they eliminated blind spots. It was a genuine tactical formation, but Ted kept insisting that Abel help them reach the opposing side. Meanwhile, even Elisa was struggling despite possessing stronger magic. Seeing this, Abel admitted that the enemy's teamwork was impressive. Suddenly, their leader mocked them, saying they could not even execute a basic pincer attack. At that point, Abel called Ted over and asked him to come closer, leaving Ted confused. Abel explained that Elisa was beginning to run out of stamina and that Ted would be the key piece of the plan. Afterward, the two quickly discussed their strategy in whispers. Then they turned their attention back to the opposing team. A determined look soon appeared in Ted's eyes. He raised his hand and began casting holy spears. Meanwhile, the opposing team watched in puzzled silence. Even so, Ted remained motionless, continuing his lengthy chant. Abel began finding the unusually long casting time rather strange. Ignoring that concern, he started channeling his own magic as well. As Ted continued reciting the spell, magical energy gathered and twisted around his hand. With a final shout, he released power drawn from the abhorrent void. At the same moment, Abel quietly spoke the word Het, and Ted completed the spell known as Tempest Abel. While their opponents were still stunned, one of them suddenly pointed toward the sky above. Countless spears of light descended all at once and crashed down with overwhelming force. The impact slammed the entire group into the ground. Even then, the bully leader tried to stand, only to be struck directly by another attack. Witnessing everything, the referee stood frozen in shock at the sight of the defeated team. After a moment of hesitation, he declared Team Dell the winner. Hearing the announcement, Elisa shouted excitedly that they had done it. Because of that, the rest of the team also erupted with joy. Soon afterward, Elisa approached Ted and asked why he had never used that ability before, but Ted explained that it had happened completely by accident. Hearing that, Abel was happy to let the attention remain focused on Ted, though he noticed the bully leader cursing in frustration and complaining about the humiliation of losing to an outsider. Abel then remarked that the leader might never understand their efforts, but he knew Ted had earned his place through skill and determination, something even the bullies could recognize. Even so, the final blow had been delivered by Abel rather than Ted. Still, he could not ignore the countless hours Ted had spent studying and training for the entrance exam. After all, Abel had witnessed that dedication firsthand. Faced with that reality, the bully leader finally lowered his head in defeat. Suddenly, someone appeared in front of him. It was Ted, apologizing for grabbing his collar and inviting him to share some manju together someday. Watching this, Abel realized that Ted's obsession with manju had not changed at all. After several moments of silence, the bully ignored the offered handshake and instead helped his fallen teammates to their feet. Elisa commented on how cold his reaction was despite Ted's apology, but Ted replied that the boy had not completely rejected his hand, so he considered it progress. Hearing that, Elisa called him hopeless, but Ted remained firmly committed to making 100 friends. Meanwhile, Abel simply smiled as he watched the exchange. Later, inside the academy, the headmaster could be seen walking through the corridors before quickly descending a staircase. He then approached a nearby door and unlocked it with magic. The moment he entered, he immediately noticed that the room was in complete disarray. In response, Emerson apologized for the mess and invited him to take a seat. However, the headmaster's attention was drawn to a monitor, and he remarked that Emerson had been reviewing the footage repeatedly. Emerson explained that the images came from a surveillance aircraft he had personally developed. In the recording, Ted could be seen casting his magic and striking the opposing team. The headmaster's interest immediately deepened, and Emerson realized that he had noticed it as well. He pointed out that a concealed spell was present in the footage, something very few people would be able to detect. Looking more closely at the recording, it was possible to see Abel subtly moving his lips as he recited a spell. Because of this, Emerson swore that he would uncover Abel's true identity. Several days later, Abel finally had the chance to explore the capital's culture alongside Elisa. On his way out, he spotted Lilith at the reception desk and asked whether she was on duty that day. Seeing him, she asked if he was heading to the library again, but he simply handed her a document. When she saw that it was a leave permit, he explained that he was going into the city. Lilith's expression immediately became a little gloomy. She then asked whether he would be going with Elisa, which left him confused. Lilith explained that earlier she had received a similar request from a student named Elisa. After hearing that, Abel asked whether there was a problem, and she replied that there was not. Even so, she still seemed hesitant. A moment later, she said it was nothing and wished him a good time, and he replied that he would enjoy himself. Even so, Lilith felt slightly lonelier as he prepared to leave. She called out his name once more and grabbed his uniform. Abel stopped immediately, feeling somewhat awkward. She then asked whether he could go out with her again someday. After a brief pause, he agreed. Hearing his answer, Lilith smiled. Abel thought she had an unexpectedly adorable side, and that despite having lived for 2 centuries, she still occasionally showed a childlike expression. Suddenly, he remembered when she had said that she admired him deeply. As he walked away, he concluded that she had probably meant nothing more than respect. Meanwhile, in the city, Elisa waited patiently. After a while, Abel arrived and apologized if he had kept her waiting. She replied that she had only just arrived herself. Even so, Elisa seemed surprised that Abel had apologized, which made him ask whether that was unusual, but she merely said she had not expected it. Setting that aside, Elisa said she would act as his guide since it was his first time visiting the royal capital. Abel agreed and said he would leave it in her hands. Their first destination was the Memorial Clock Tower, built upon ancient ruins and equipped with an observation deck. Looking around, Abel found the mechanisms fascinating because of how carefully organized they were. Suddenly, Elisa called him over to look through the window. From there, they could see the distant sea, and while examining the view carefully, Abel noticed a ship and asked if it was what he thought it was. Surprised, Elisa asked whether he had never heard of steamships. After she explained, he learned that it was a vessel powered by magic stone fuel and capable of crossing the ocean. Seeing it, he thought the ship must be enormous to remain visible from such a distance, and imagined that observing it up close would reveal even more. Elisa also stared at it with great interest. Suddenly, Abel began smiling as he thought that the day was turning out quite well. Elisa then found herself watching him more closely. Later, after seeing a movie, Abel felt that he had gained a much better understanding of the culture of that era, though countless things in the city still remained unfamiliar to him. As they walked, he asked about a nearby shop because its flashy sign had caught his attention. Elisa struggled to explain it at first, but eventually said that it was a game center. Since Abel still did not understand, she added that it was a place where people spent their free time and money on entertainment and games. Hearing that, Abel found it interesting because entertainment culture had developed in a completely different direction from what he remembered. Curious, he suggested that they go inside, although Elisa was also uncertain since it would be her first visit as well. The two entered together, unaware that a regalia spy was already watching them from within the building. They saw numerous people enjoying different games, but their attention was quickly diverted when someone noticed they were students. Suddenly, a skeletal mascot tapped Elisa on the shoulder and asked what she was doing there. The sight of the skeleton startled Elisa, and she instinctively grabbed onto Abel, who calmly told her to relax. He explained that it was merely an artificial figure animated through magic. Realizing that, Elisa immediately let go and apologized. The skeleton replied that reactions like that were nothing new to him, though Elisa clarified that her apology had not been directed at him. Putting that aside, the skeleton informed them that the section with spinning games was restricted to adults and directed them toward the area open to all ages. The two headed there, and Abel soon found himself surrounded by all sorts of unusual attractions. Suddenly, Elisa pointed excitedly at something and rushed toward a claw machine. Looking inside, she confirmed that it truly contained a low-level monster figure. Excitedly, she said that she loved that particular series. Abel looked puzzled, so she explained that it was a collection based on legendary magical beasts from ancient times, redesigned into cute forms and marketed as low-level monsters. She also mentioned that there were 200 varieties, and that the collection was extremely popular among young people. Hearing that, Abel inspected the doll more carefully. It did not take long for him to realize it looked familiar, since he had fought creatures resembling it in the past. Suddenly, Elisa pointed to her favorite monster, named James. She admitted that his appearance was not the type most girls would obsess over, but she believed he would be formidable in combat. Abel confirmed that assessment. He explained that James's breath could turn anything into stone, and that 3 villagers had once been petrified by it. He also added that they had defeated it using wind magic. Afterward, they rescued the villagers and developed a spell capable of reversing petrification. After hearing all that, Elisa fell silent. A moment later, Abel realized he might have revealed too much. Seeing her bewildered expression, he understood that he had spoken far too naturally about powerful enemies from long ago. Now he found himself wondering how to explain that. Suddenly, Elisa burst out laughing and said she had not expected him to tell such an elaborate joke. Abel decided not to pursue the matter further, but she called out to him again. Elisa then asked whether he found it strange that she preferred strong characters over cute ones. She wondered if he thought that made her less feminine, revealing a trace of insecurity. He replied that it was perfectly natural for people to have different tastes. He also said that it suited her well, and that what mattered most was a person's nature, rather than outward appearances. Those words left Elisa completely stunned, though she still managed to thank him. After that, she admitted once more that James was her favorite. Abel then asked whether she wanted the doll. She shyly answered yes, though she believed winning it was impossible because the claw looked too weak to lift it. Abel studied the machine for a moment and agreed. Using his analytical eyes, he quickly determined that the claw had intentionally been made weak. On top of that, the controls had clearly been designed to be frustrating. After reaching that conclusion, he remarked that the business practice was rather dishonest. Even so, he felt no guilt about what he intended to do next, prompting Elisa to ask whether he was planning to win the doll. After inserting a coin, Abel replied that magicians like them specialized in making the impossible possible, so it could hardly be considered theft. After all, he had paid the required fee to play, so he activated his magic, blending physical force with magical energy. As a result, energy wrapped around the claw, allowing it to grip the doll securely, lift it up, and carry it over before releasing it. Moments later, the doll dropped into the prize compartment. Meanwhile, Abel found it both fascinating and oddly disappointing to encounter James again after 2 centuries. After collecting the prize, he handed the doll to Elisa, who stood motionless for a moment. Even so, she accepted it and said she would keep it for the time being. She also promised to take good care of it, though her flushed cheeks suggested she was embarrassed. Afterward, the two decided to stop and enjoy a dessert. Elisa was clearly having fun and remarked that the sweets there were on a completely different level, while Abel finally understood what she meant. Suddenly, when Abel cut off a piece of his dessert, she asked whether she could try some. He thought that food on someone else's plate always seemed more tempting, so he extended his fork and asked for a taste of hers in return. Instead, Elisa quickly leaned forward and took the bite directly from his fork. Afterward, she commented that the dark chocolate added a distinctive touch and declared that it tasted amazing. In exchange, she offered him a bite of her dessert, which Abel accepted. After tasting it, he remarked that he usually disliked sweets, but this one was easy to enjoy. Hearing that, Elisa nodded and said that was exactly why it was her favorite. However, Abel found it interesting that she was not particularly picky about food, which left her confused. He then explained that he had read that sharing utensils was often considered an indirect kiss, causing her face to turn bright red. Because of that reaction, he assumed she had not known, and had simply been focused on enjoying the dessert. Noticing her embarrassment, he apologized for bringing up something unnecessary. In a slightly panicked tone, Elisa replied that indirect kisses were completely normal, and did not bother her at all. Hearing that, Abel answered that everything was fine then. Even so, he could tell she still seemed troubled, but he chose to trust her words. Changing the subject, he looked around and remarked that this street felt different from the others. Elisa noticed it as well and commented that the area had a retro atmosphere. Abel agreed, saying that it felt nostalgic. At those words, her expression suddenly became serious. She then explained that there was a difference between something being retro and something being nostalgic, which immediately put her on alert. After that, she asked who he really was. From the entrance examination to the enchantments he had placed on his uniform, Elisa believed that Abel's abilities were far beyond what could be expected from an ordinary student. Upon hearing that, Abel began considering how he should answer, since he wanted to keep his past hidden and share it only with Lilith to avoid unnecessary trouble. At this point, all he wanted was a peaceful and uneventful life. Before he could reply, something shining behind Elisa caught his eye. The moment he noticed it, he decided that dealing with it came first. As he rose from his seat, he thought that being watched at school was one thing, but being monitored outside of it was unacceptable. Elisa noticed him moving and started asking what he was doing, but Abel kept walking toward her. As a result, she froze when his face moved closer, causing her to panic internally. At that moment, Abel launched a fireball enhanced with accelerated projectile speed. Shortly afterward, a sharp explosion echoed behind her. Seeing Elisa's startled reaction, Abel remarked that it was probably just a faulty street lamp, and attempted to resume their conversation. But Elisa cut him off, and her mood shifted. Afterward, she told him to forget the matter and apologized for prying into his affairs. Abel was confused, but Elisa stayed silent and kept her gaze lowered, thinking that she did not want to feel shut out. After all, she was already certain of her feelings toward him. Later, while they were on their way back, Abel could still sense that someone was observing him and decided it was time to handle it. He stopped walking and told Elisa to return on her own. Confused, she asked why. He explained that he had forgotten something at the last shop they visited and needed to go back. After hearing that, she reluctantly agreed and said she would see him the next day. Abel nodded and thanked her. Once she left, he headed into a nearby alley. When he stopped, he turned around and stated that he knew someone was there. He also mentioned that there were 2 people and ordered them to reveal themselves. Soon afterward, a woman stepped out and remarked that Abel had sent Elisa away because of them. For that reason, she said she admired clever children like him. Abel noticed her silver eyes and realized she was using magic to blend into her surroundings. In addition, her clothing was deliberately minimal in order to improve the precision of her magic. Suddenly, another voice spoke up, surprised that a mere kid had detected their presence. He added that it was uncommon for someone so young to realize they were being tailed. When Abel saw him leap down, he noticed his emerald green eyes and concluded that he was a wind mage. The woman then commented that Abel had lived up to the expectations of the person who had recognized his talent. Seeing that, Abel demanded to know who that person was and what their objective might be. At that moment, the man scolded the woman for saying too much. Even so, he insisted that they were still professionals. The woman added that she would never reveal a client's identity, not even when facing death. In response, Abel raised his hand as magic began gathering around him. He remarked that opponents like them were exactly what motivated him. Meanwhile, back at the academy, Emerson reflected that no human would ever fight an insect, just as no human would debate the stars with a monkey. Because of that, he felt there was no one in the world truly capable of discussing magic with him. His talent as a mage had been obvious since childhood. By the time he became a student, he had already created his own regalia. Both his talent and his invention were revolutionary. Yet people merely said it must be nice to be a genius and that his work was too difficult to understand. On top of that, he often heard others claim that he probably looked down on everyone around him. Over time, he realized that extraordinary talent often came with profound loneliness. When he entered the academy, he tried to make others understand him, but he soon discovered a painful truth. Forcing understanding between people of vastly different abilities was pointless. Just as a diamond can only be polished by another diamond or something even harder. In the same way, a mage could only continue growing by facing someone of comparable level. Without that, there could be no progress. Because of that suffocating stagnation, he eventually lost his reason to keep striving. However, Abel changed everything. Watching and measuring Abel's abilities had given him hope that he could evolve once more. Feeling his heart race with anticipation, he decided to take action and recruited Musen and Barton, two of the leading mages within the Chrono Society. After making that decision, he returned to his room using magic. As he opened the door, he was still thinking about how he could learn more about Abel. However, he froze when he realized someone was already inside. There sat Abel, casually occupying his chair and apologizing for making himself comfortable. Startled, Emerson nervously asked how Abel had managed to enter. After all, multiple barriers protected the room. Abel dismissed those barriers as though they were made of paper. Seeing that, Emerson acknowledged his talent and considered checking the source of Abel's magic once again. However, he stopped when Abel stated that his friends had already told him everything. Furthermore, he knew that Emerson had been controlling the spying regalia. Abel then ordered him to stop using it. At that point, Emerson fell silent, since not only had his associates been defeated, but they had also exposed him. He began to suspect that Abel had used brainwashing magic, something that required both exceptional intellect and tremendous skill. Even so, he asked what Abel would do if he refused. Almost instantly, he recoiled as the atmosphere changed. Abel's expression hardened, and he declared that Emerson would die right there. The overwhelming killing intent crashing down on him caused Emerson's hands to shake uncontrollably. Realizing he could not endure it much longer, he shouted that he understood. He quickly assured Abel that he would comply with the demand, and the oppressive pressure gradually faded away. After that, Abel thanked him. Suddenly, Emerson said there was one thing he wanted to know. He asked why someone as powerful as Abel remained at the academy when there was nothing left there for him to learn. Abel replied that his sole objective was to enjoy a peaceful school life and nothing more. Hearing that, Emerson asked whether he was simply there to enjoy his youth, and Abel confirmed that he was. Even so, Emerson found it impossible to accept. He insisted that Abel's talent surpassed even his own, and that such ability should not be wasted among ordinary students. Stepping closer, he declared that Abel possessed the power to transform the entire world. He went on to say that Abel could stand above ordinary people, and that someone with such gifts ought to reveal them to society. Abel, however, sidestepped him and told him to move aside. He then stated that he had no interest in hearing any further opinions from him. After the door shut, Emerson felt the strength leave his body. Despite having encountered countless geniuses throughout his life, he had never experienced such overwhelming killing intent. Even so, he could not stop admiring Abel and felt that at last there was hope for his own advancement. Later that night, Elisa went to Ted and told him that Abel was not in his room. She mentioned that she had expected to find him there, but Ted replied that Abel disappearing without notice was nothing unusual. Even so, he offered to pass along her message, but Elisa chose to speak to Abel herself the following day. Later, outside, Elisa sat alone on a bench while holding her plush doll. She quietly muttered that all she wanted was to thank Abel. Suddenly, she heard a voice remark that they had been summoned unexpectedly. She immediately recognized Abel's voice and hurried toward the sound. When she got closer, she saw Abel together with Lilith. The sight caught her completely off guard. Meanwhile, Abel looked puzzled while Lilith said that she had only wanted to hear his voice. He reminded her to avoid doing anything that would attract attention and asked her to return, adding that they could talk after school if she needed to. Neither of them noticed Elisa watching from a distance. Without warning, Lilith kissed Abel on the forehead, bringing their faces close together while she continued leaning against him. She appeared entirely at ease when he remarked that she had not changed at all. Meanwhile, Elisa hid behind a bush in embarrassment, panicking as she tried to process what she had just witnessed. The next day in the city, Yukarak greeted Elisa cheerfully. However, her smile faded as soon as she sensed that something was wrong. Elisa answered without enthusiasm, causing Yukarak to wonder whether something had happened. She also found it strange that Elisa ordered only coffee, since she normally loved sweets. Concerned, she said she was willing to listen if Elisa wanted to talk. After a brief silence, Elisa admitted that she had seen something disturbing. She explained that she had seen Abel with Lilith and that the two had been kissing. She then called Yukarak by name and asked whether they were in a relationship. Seeing this, Yukarak realized that Elisa had feelings for Abel and quickly tried to reassure her. She explained that Abel and Lilith were blood relatives. Hearing that, Elisa was stunned, and Yukarak added that it was fairly well known, and that even Ted was aware of it, though he thought the two behaved somewhat differently from most siblings. Even so, Elisa insisted that it still was not normal. They were related by blood, yet they met in secret and kissed. Yukarak replied that the teacher-student relationship made their interactions more complicated, which immediately caught Elisa's attention. She then explained that if they truly shared a very close family bond, occasional displays of affection through kisses would not necessarily be strange. After thinking it over for a while, Elisa admitted that Yukarak had a point. Once she had time to process everything, she loudly concluded that there was nothing wrong with family members kissing. Even so, the fact that Emerson addressed Abel as Abel-sama still bothered her. However, she decided that there were many different kinds of families in the world. Feeling more at ease, she thanked Yukarak and said her appetite had returned. Yukarak felt relieved, but was immediately startled when Elisa quickly ordered a cake along with an enormous bucket-sized parfait. Meanwhile, inside the academy, several students watched a first-year student exercising nearby as he ran. They wondered how long he had been training, and one estimated around 2 hours, astonishing the others. As he ran, Abel reflected that physical training ought to be part of his regular routine. However, despite it being a day off, the training room remained completely empty. To him, this showed that modern mages neglected physical knowledge and conditioning. Not long afterward, Ted appeared, shouting that he had been searching everywhere for him. He then asked whether Abel had been there the entire time. Abel found it troublesome that Ted of all people had discovered him in such a peaceful place. Even so, he asked what Ted wanted. Ted asked whether Abel had already chosen a research group. Hearing that, Abel vaguely recalled the topic being mentioned during the entrance ceremony. Ted commented that he had completely forgotten about it, and Abel admitted that he had never been interested in the first place. Even so, Ted explained that research groups were clubs where students studied magic or regalia. Some were even recognized nationwide, but Abel viewed them as nothing more than student-level activities. Nevertheless, Ted invited him to attend the research group recruitment event. Abel refused immediately, saying that it did not interest him. Based on his experience, he believed the most effective way to research magic was by working alone. In addition, he doubted that teamwork could produce better results. Ted persisted, arguing that it was a great opportunity, and suggesting that there might be a group capable of capturing Abel's interest. Seeing Abel remain silent, Ted continued and revealed that the event also featured sports and unusual applications of magic. Upon hearing that, Abel thought it might serve as harmless entertainment, even though he had no prior experience with such activities. Besides, Ted's determined persistence left him with very little room to refuse. In the end, he agreed and said he would go change his clothes first, which clearly pleased Ted. Later, outside, Ted was amazed by the atmosphere. The place was packed with people and buzzing with excitement, almost like a festival. Suddenly, someone approached them offering information about the Fire Magic Research Club, while another student promoted the Hunting Research Club. Watching the scene, Abel noticed that most of the clubs revolved around either magic or sports. Given the sheer number of options, it seemed unlikely they could visit them all. All of a sudden, someone began calling out to them. When they turned around, they saw a man dressed in full armor, leaving Ted briefly confused about why a knight was there. The man removed his helmet and explained that it was merely gaming equipment. He immediately noticed Ted's sturdy build and suggested that he join the Army Foot Club. He explained that the Army Foot Club was a demanding combat sport involving magical armor, though his lengthy explanation only made Ted increasingly uncomfortable. Meanwhile, Abel recognized the sport as a descendant of rugby from centuries ago. Ted admitted that he enjoyed physical activities, but asked whether Abel would participate as well. When the man learned that Abel had amber eyes, he hesitated. Abel had expected that reaction, since amber-eyed mages were often viewed as failures. Shortly afterward, another man approached. Apparently, he was the team's captain and asked what was happening. The first man explained that he had found a promising freshman, but Ted had a condition. He told the captain that Ted would only join if his amber-eyed friend were also allowed to try out. The captain rejected the idea without hesitation. He declared that allowing someone with inferior eyes into the club would tarnish its honor. Hearing that, Abel found the rudeness unnecessary, though at least it gave him a reason to leave. However, he noticed Ted's anger and reminded him not to react to every insult before turning away. Abel stated that he had no interest in playing ball anyway. At that, the captain interrupted and demanded that he repeat himself. Abel Sani repeated that he had no desire to play ball. Enraged, the captain declared that he would not tolerate disrespect from someone so ignorant. Ted and Abel simply stared at him in disbelief. Without another word, the captain took an offensive stance and challenged Abel, saying he would understand after taking a hit. As the attack came, Abel moved first and swiftly kicked the captain's leg. As a result, the captain stumbled while tossing the ball into the air. He managed to regain his footing, but his expression grew even darker. For the second time, he charged at Abel with determination. In response, Abel casually stepped aside. Noticing the ball still in the air, he decided it was time to end the matter. While it was still descending, he remarked that he would return the ball. Then he infused it with enhancement magic and hurled it back. The ball struck the captain squarely in the face, knocking him unconscious and sending him crashing to the ground. Seeing the captain collapse heavily, the people nearby wondered what had just happened. Abel realized he might have gone a little too far, but Ted continued celebrating while everyone else stood frozen. As some people rushed to help the captain, Ted and Abel quietly slipped away. Afterward, they continued exploring the event. However, many of the magic-focused clubs lacked real skill, while the sports clubs demanded heavy commitments, even on weekends. Ted received numerous invitations, but Abel preferred training at his own pace. This only strengthened his belief that joining a club was unnecessary. However, his attention shifted when a loud voice began speaking about eliminating war from the world. Nearby, a group of students wearing robes was inviting people to join their cause for peace. Looking more closely, Abel noticed their insignia and realized they belonged to a magic eradication club, whose goal was to remove magic from the world. He wondered why people like that would enroll in a magic academy. Suddenly, one of the members began proclaiming the greatness of the anti-magic club, and speaking of an approaching revolution. The moment Abel saw his face, he immediately recognized him. It was Basis, whom he had heard was studying at the academy, though he had not expected to encounter him like this. However, Basis looked pale and frail, and even Ted stopped talking when he saw him. Abel's gaze lingered on his eyes, making him wonder whether he was truly alright. At that moment, a familiar figure nearby caught his attention. It was the leader of the bullies. Abel called out to him. The young man hesitated when he noticed Abel, but Abel gestured for him to come closer and questioned him before he could finish speaking. Abel asked about the group standing in front of them. Realizing who he meant, the boy asked whether Abel had never heard of the organization AMO. When he saw that Abel genuinely did not know, he explained that AMO was an anti-magic organization. Publicly, they preached peace and the end of war, but their use of radical methods and ideologies was a well-known issue, though Abel seemed unaware of it. He then suggested that Abel study subjects beyond magic, and changed the topic. He asked whether Abel had chosen a club yet, but Abel replied that he had not. The boy commented that nobody wanted a student with inferior eyes, but Abel told him to leave. Even so, he refused and said he knew the perfect club for him. He then asked Abel to follow him to a club that would actually accept him. Seeing this, Abel agreed, saying that one more disappointment would make no difference, which irritated the boy. After walking for some time, they finally stopped, and he pointed toward a table ahead. A girl was sitting there holding a parasol. The moment he saw her, Abel sensed that something was unusual. He noticed that everyone avoided walking near her without even glancing in her direction. Suddenly, the boy told him that her name was Noel, a student known throughout the academy as the Ice Queen. Seeing Abel's confusion, he explained that everyone from the preparatory school knew who she was. After all, she excelled in both academics and combat, yet avoided forming any kind of personal connections. Furthermore, no one had ever seen her smile, which was how she had earned her nickname. Even so, he thought Abel might get along with her, since people with similar personalities often gravitated toward one another. Abel then observed Noel from a distance. He noticed that her sapphire-colored eyes marked her as a specialist in water attribute magic, which likely inspired her title. In addition, she radiated power far beyond what was typical for a student. Suddenly, Abel spotted a book about ancient magic on her table, and began wondering what people in the current era actually considered ancient magic. Noel, however, seemed completely unaware of his presence. As he approached the table, Abel lightly tapped its surface to get her attention. She immediately raised her eyes toward him. Abel then said that he was interested in the club and remarked that her uniform was the same as his. His tone remained casual throughout. Without warning, Noel set her book aside and handed him a box to solve. The moment he saw it, Abel was mildly surprised. It was something known as the Labyrinth Corridor, a device designed to test a person's ability to decipher complex magical syntax through a puzzle-like challenge. To Abel, it stirred a sense of nostalgia, and the craftsmanship was detailed enough to suggest it was not mass-produced. Because of that, he suspected Noel had built it herself. Focusing on the task, he began analyzing the magical syntax embedded within the box. He then channeled magic into it, adjusting the correct sequence of internal pathways. Within moments, the mechanism opened with a sharp click. Seeing this, Noel's eyes widened in astonishment. Abel simply handed the solved box back without saying a word. She immediately inspected it for damage, but he assured her that it was untouched, and that he had genuinely solved the puzzle. Even so, Noel seemed skeptical, since a challenge like that should have taken at least an hour to complete. Abel then reminded her that he had passed the test, and that it was now her turn to explain the club. Noel agreed and decided to take him to the club room. With that, the two of them headed back into the academy. Along the way, Abel noticed that they were passing through a restricted area, and asked whether they were really going the right way. Noel merely replied that they had already arrived. In front of them stood nothing more than an ordinary wall. However, Abel immediately understood what it was. Noel removed the necklace she was wearing, whose pendant was made from engraved metal, and pressed it against the wall like a key. A glowing doorway instantly appeared on the surface. Seeing that, Abel realized it was a hidden entrance. The two of them stepped inside. As soon as they entered, Noel led him into the club room. While she occupied herself with a few things, Abel looked around the area. The room was packed with shelves containing thousands of books. He remarked that it was unusually large for a student club, and asked where the other members were. Noel replied that there was no one else. That answer left Abel confused. She then clarified that there were no other members at all. Hearing that, Abel quickly understood the reason. If solving the labyrinth corridor served as the entrance exam, very few students would be capable of passing it. He began examining the bookshelves and noticed that many of the books were quite old. The one in his hand, for example, was roughly 50 years old. He then asked which book was the oldest. Noel replied that a few were around 100 years old, but none were older than that. Most ancient texts had been destroyed during the Great Calamity. Hearing that, Abel was not particularly surprised. More than 200 years earlier, his party of heroes had defeated the Demon King and brought peace to the world. However, only a year later, disputes over the conquered territories triggered a human war that lasted for an entire century. That conflict became known as the Great Calamity, and the death toll likely surpassed even that of the war against the Demon King. Noel added that the prolonged conflict had exhausted humanity and strengthened anti-magic movements. Those groups sought to eliminate magic from the world entirely. During that process, most magical texts were burned. Abel was surprised, though not exactly outraged. Noel explained that even some influential leaders had supported anti-magic movements. As a result, discussing the book burnings had become almost taboo, and modern magic was merely a shadow of what had once existed. Because of that, the purpose of her club was to rediscover and study ancient magic. Seeing this, Abel considered the goal a noble one. Most people of that era were not even aware that magic was declining. Therefore, simply recognizing that reality was enough proof that Noel was an exceptional mage. Suddenly, she asked somewhat nervously whether he was going to laugh at her. Many people, after all, claimed that regalia-based magic was far more practical. Indeed, regalia allowed anyone to use magic in a standardized way, and that approach had become the norm. However, Noel had devoted her entire life exclusively to the study of ancient magic. Because of that, other mages viewed her as strange, which had likely left her isolated. Even so, Abel assured her that he would not laugh. Moreover, he had no interest in mocking the efforts of others. Hearing that, Noel found it intriguing and asked for his name. Abel gave his answer. She then introduced herself as Noel. Shortly afterward, she showed him the key to the room and handed him a copy, asking him to return the next day because there was something she wanted to show him. The following day at the academy, Abel tried waiting for Ted, but classes had already ended. He assumed Ted was probably exhausted after being chased around by sports clubs trying to recruit him, so he decided to leave him alone. Furthermore, Abel assumed that some club captain would eventually recruit Ted before long. While he was thinking about that, someone called out to him. Turning around, he saw Elisa walking toward him. She asked whether he had already chosen a research club. Abel replied that he had looked at a few of them but had not made a final decision yet. Elisa then mentioned that she planned to visit a club the following afternoon. She added that she had always wanted to ride a dragon and asked whether he would like to come along. After glancing at the flyer, Abel realized it was for the Dragonflight Club. Once he noticed that, he remembered that he had not encountered a dragon since being reincarnated, so he agreed to join her. Elisa was visibly excited before heading off. Before leaving, she reminded him of his promise and told him he was not allowed to back out. Seeing that, Abel thought she ought to make more friends instead of relying so heavily on him. Afterward, he continued on his way. A little farther ahead, he noticed someone and recognized Emerson. Abel called out to him. When Emerson turned around, Abel asked what he was doing in front of the club room. Upon realizing it was Abel, Emerson greeted him warmly, but Abel repeated the question. Emerson then explained that he served as the advisor for the Ancient Magic Club and occasionally stopped by to check on things. He assured him there was nothing suspicious about it. Even so, Abel did not appear convinced. Emerson then asked him to place a little trust in him. After that, he asked why Abel was there. Abel answered that he had something to do inside the club room. At that, Emerson immediately understood what he meant. He began to suspect that Noel might also have taken an interest in Abel. As a result, he decided to chat with him for a while. He explained that Noel had entered the academy through the principal's recommendation and was the only first-year student exempt from attending classes. That was because her abilities surpassed those of most instructors. As a result, the academy could not provide lessons suited to her level. Instead, she had been granted access to the secret library and allowed to pursue her studies independently. Emerson then remarked that Abel possessed the qualifications for the same treatment and offered to exempt him from classes as well. Abel rejected the offer without hesitation. Emerson then pointed out that Abel often claimed to want an ordinary life. When Abel looked at him, Emerson said that his actions suggested otherwise, considering he was associating with someone everyone else avoided. Abel replied that he was only interested in her books, but Emerson disagreed. He asked why Abel sought out ancient texts when he knew people would view him differently because of it. He also remarked that life would be much easier if Abel simply minded his own business. Then he asked why he was so invested in the matter. Suddenly, Emerson reached a hand toward Abel's face, but after a brief moment of consideration, he merely patted him lightly on the shoulder. After that, he said goodbye and walked away. Abel remained silent. Soon afterward, he used his analytical ability on his shoulder and discovered that Emerson had planted a magical surveillance device there. He removed it immediately and decided to inspect the club room as well. Meanwhile, Emerson realized his trick had failed. Back inside the club room, Abel finally entered. The moment Noelle saw him, she immediately rose from her chair. Abel set his bag on the floor, and she quickly walked over to him. She then said that she had been waiting for him. Hearing that, Abel briefly thought she was behaving like some kind of pet, but he dismissed the idea. He then remembered why he had come and immediately asked what she wanted to show him. Noel picked up a box from the table, removed a book from it, and handed it to Abel. She explained that she had brought it from her home. Looking closely, Abel noticed burn marks on the book, but it was bound by magical chains covered in intricate inscriptions, making it difficult to open. Noel then revealed that it was known as the Kasich Records. Upon hearing that name, Abel recalled reading about the item in historical documents. Legends claim that mastering the magic contained within it granted dominion over the world, a belief that had sparked wars even during the Great Calamity. He did not ask why she had brought it. Noel replied that she wanted to read ancient books. Seeing how casually she handled such an artifact, Abel suspected she came from nobility or perhaps even royalty. At the very least, she was no ordinary person and had likely been raised under unusual circumstances. Suddenly, Noel began removing the chains from the book so she could show him her treasure. As he examined it, Abel realized the magical formulas inside were extraordinarily refined and precise. Although the burn damage had rendered parts unreadable, much could still be inferred from what remained. Even so, he could not imagine who might have written formulas that sophisticated 200 years earlier. As he turned the pages, the familiar style of writing caught his attention. When he reached the final page and read the words, "To my dear companion Daytona," he was stunned. He then asked whether the book had been passed down through her family. Noel replied that she had discovered it in a family storage room, and that one of her ancestors had received it from a highly skilled mage. Hearing that, Abel's suspicions were confirmed. Noel then asked whether he could read the book. Of course he could. After all, he had written it himself. It was composed in an ancient language that would be difficult for anyone except a dedicated scholar to understand. Even so, Abel explained that the page dealt with resurrection magic, which left Noel astonished, since such magic was far beyond the level of an ordinary student. Abel briefly described the contents while studying her face. He noticed that she resembled Daytona in her younger years. Because of that, he became certain that Noel was a descendant of the hero of water. Noel was fascinated and even asked him to teach her more about the book. Abel declined, saying that curfew was approaching and that he would be busy the next day as well. Noel was visibly disappointed. Seeing her reaction, Abel offered her a deal. If she allowed him to keep using the club room, he would teach her how to read the book the next time they met. Caught off guard, Noel happily agreed. The following day, after classes ended, a student at the Dragon Stables welcomed the visitors and thanked them for coming to the Dragonflight Club. The overly enthusiastic reception surprised Abel and the others. On top of that, the members dressed flamboyantly and wore heavy cologne. It was hard to believe those young men were dragon riders. Taking care of dragons was no easy task. They consumed enormous amounts of food, possessed high intelligence, and could become aggressive without warning. Abel found it difficult to imagine such carefree youths handling that level of responsibility. Elisa began apologizing, saying she had not realized the club was like this. At that moment, a girl asked if she could ask a question, and the club leader gave his permission. She asked what separated their club from the Dragon Knights Club. The leader answered that the biggest difference was the atmosphere. Their club's purpose was simply to have fun. Therefore, everyone was free to enjoy themselves, whether they rode dragons or not. Hearing that, Abel understood why the environment felt so relaxed, though he still found it odd. In his era, dragons had been regarded as valuable assets rather than recreational attractions. It showed just how peaceful the world had become. Suddenly, the leader announced that it was time to ride the dragons and instructed the visitors to pair up with veteran members. Abel noticed that all the veterans were pairing off with the girls. Besides him, every visitor was female, while all the experienced members were male. It became obvious that the dragons were merely an excuse for flirting. The leader then approached Elisa, assuming she had come because of him. Elisa quickly clarified that she had come with her friend. The leader immediately shot a cold glance at Abel. Even so, he asked Elisa whether she would like to fly with him and promised to prepare the finest dragon available. Elisa cut him off and stated that she wanted to fly with Abel. The leader explained that the dragons only had 2 seats and that 2 beginners were not allowed to ride together. Elisa hesitated. Abel knew how excited she had been for this, so he told her not to worry about him and simply enjoy the experience. To his surprise, that only seemed to irritate her. Afterward, Elisa agreed in a curt manner. Abel was left confused, wondering why she was upset when he had only tried to be considerate. Later, as they walked deeper inside, the leader assured Elisa that Abel would also be given a dragon. Meanwhile, Abel noticed the strong odor of the stables, which brought back old memories. Dragons had tremendous energy requirements. An adult dragon needed roughly 300 kilograms of food every day. Naturally, that also meant producing an enormous amount of waste. People often said that dragon keepers spent their entire day cleaning. Soon, the leader drew Elisa's attention to a particular dragon, saying it was his favorite and was named Saw Glory. Elisa was amazed, seeing such a massive dragon for the first time. Abel agreed and remarked that in his time only nobles or royalty owned dragons of that size. At first, he had worried that dragons might have declined in this age just as magic had, but it appeared that dragon breeding had improved considerably over the past 1,000 years. Suddenly, the leader called out to Abel and said that the remaining dragons were housed in a room farther back, inviting him to choose whichever one he liked. After that, he took Elisa outside to begin the flight. Before leaving, Elisa glanced at Abel and reluctantly agreed to go. Once they were gone, Abel noticed that everyone else had already left as well. He then headed toward the room where the other dragons were kept. Someone stopped him and asked what he was doing there. The man explained that the dragon inside was called Leon and that it hated humans. For that reason, he warned Abel not to enter carelessly. Afterward, the man apologized for shouting and explained that he was the dragon's caretaker. Abel replied that it was not a problem. The caretaker then offered to take him inside for a quick look. When the door opened, Abel was impressed by what he saw. Inside stood an enormous red dragon confined behind iron bars. The moment their eyes met, Abel remarked that it was a magnificent creature. The caretaker explained that Leon was the oldest dragon and a former champion racer, but he had become aggressive after the death of his favorite rider. Some people believed it would be better to put him down. Even so, Leon was beloved by the younger dragons and helped keep them calm. The caretaker admitted that he could never bring himself to kill him despite all the difficulties. Leon, however, completely ignored the man. Because of that, the caretaker warned Abel to be careful and avoid getting hurt, hoping to prevent further discussions about sacrificing the dragon. Abel understood that dragons were proud beings. He could tell that Leon was old, but he was also the strongest dragon there. He suspected Leon was concealing his true power to avoid serving humans he considered unworthy. With that in mind, Abel spoke to Leon and asked if he could come closer. The instant he extended his hand, Leon became alert. The caretaker tried to stop Abel and told him to step back, but Abel simply signaled for him to remain quiet. Realizing that he had the dragon's full attention, Abel said that Leon did not deserve to spend his life confined and invited him to release some of his pent-up energy together. Leon remained motionless, but Abel sensed that the dragon wanted to test his mana, so he created a small sphere of magic and allowed it to drift slowly toward the dragon. The caretaker watched in stunned disbelief as Abel carried out this strange action. A few moments later, Leon lowered his head before him. The caretaker stammered, unable to believe what he was witnessing. Then Abel told Leon that his caretaker was someone trustworthy, and that he hoped the dragon would listen to him. Leon turned his gaze toward the caretaker, who looked extremely nervous. Even so, the man asked Abel who he truly was. Abel replied that he was nothing more than a student and that he intended to take Leon out for a little while. Meanwhile, Elisa and the club leader had just finished their flight and landed. As she climbed down from the dragon, Elisa was amazed by the scenery. From that height, both the academy and the city looked tiny. She thought the experience would have been even better if Abel had been there with her. Suddenly, the leader offered her some tea, and Elisa accepted without a second thought. While she drank it, he suggested that they take a short break. Without warning, Elisa began to feel strangely ill. She noticed that the leader was holding her hand and jerked back in alarm, causing the teacup to slip from her grasp and shatter on the ground. She immediately ordered him to stop. The leader seemed puzzled by her resistance and implied that this was why she had come. He also made insulting remarks about a girl being alone with a man. Then he suddenly asked whether she would rather be with Abel, though perhaps it was already too late for that. Furious, Elisa called him a disgrace to the nobility. As she summoned her fire magic, she demanded that he prepare himself. Before she could act, her body started trembling violently, and she collapsed onto the ground. The leader smiled in satisfaction when he realized the drug was taking effect. Hearing that, Elisa understood that he had drugged her. He then bragged about his alchemical abilities and assured her that she would be unable to move. Afterward, he invited her to have some fun with him, but Elisa could only stare at him in shock before turning her gaze away. Meanwhile, Abel was busy praising Leon's incredible speed, noting that even during his own lifetime, very few dragons could rival him. Suddenly, his attention shifted when he noticed several club members nearby flirting despite belonging to a dragonflight club. Then something below caught his eye. It was the club leader, and he was leaning far too close to Elisa. At that moment, Elisa tried to call out to Abel, but the leader dismissed the idea, claiming that Abel's dragon was the weakest one. According to him, it was too stubborn to fly and far too proud, much like Elisa herself. Because of that, he suggested that Abel might have already been eaten by it. Elisa's anger immediately boiled over, and she demanded that he let her go. However, he replied that she should act more obediently if she wanted him to be nice. In response, Elisa shot him a look filled with disgust. When the leader started touching her, Elisa cried out for Abel's help. Almost instantly, the leader was seized by the head as Leon appeared beside him. Abel reminded him that any act committed without consent was strictly forbidden under academy regulations. The moment she saw Abel, Elisa felt an overwhelming sense of relief. Even so, the leader demanded that Abel stop touching him. He then asked how Abel had arrived there with Leon, but Abel answered that Leon was special and described the leader's behavior as harassment. The leader merely laughed at the accusation. He then claimed that Elisa had not been resisting and that Abel was simply interfering. Before Elisa could object, Abel spoke on her behalf. He stated that she was not some spineless aristocrat who would surrender to him and ordered him to let her go. Upon hearing that, tears welled up in Elisa's eyes. The leader then drew his regalia and mocked Abel's inferior eyes, claiming they were incapable of using magic. Next, he aimed his weapon and decided to eliminate both Abel and his dragon, firing a flaming projectile. Leon immediately shielded Abel from the attack. Seeing this, Abel leaped upward and cast magic onto Leon's wing. As a result, before the projectiles could reach them, Leon beat his wings with tremendous force and scattered them. Afterward, Abel landed behind the leader, who immediately aimed his regalia at him once again. However, Abel quickly observed the leader's wrist. After analyzing the weapon, he neutralized its magical syntax, so when the leader tried to fire again, nothing happened. Frustrated, he threw the weapon aside. Then he summoned Saint Glory to attack. The creature looked down and found Abel standing there, but before it could make a move, a powerful stomp from Leon shook the entire area. The leader, Elisa, and Abel were all briefly stunned. However, it became obvious that Leon was determined to protect Abel. Leon fixed his gaze on Glory, and the creature froze immediately. Afterward, Leon locked eyes with the leader as well. The moment Glory saw that, it understood immediately and turned toward its own master. Terrified, the leader insisted that Glory's enemies were in the opposite direction, but the dragon ignored him, grabbed him, and lifted him into the air. The leader screamed in panic while Abel and Leon watched in silence. After that, Elisa's mood changed completely, and she became cheerful again as she rode on Leon. She remarked that he was much faster than the dragon she had flown on earlier. That made Abel happy, since he had been worried she might remain upset because of what had happened. With that concern gone, he could continue patrolling, though seeing students everywhere made him think there was probably not much to worry about. While they were flying, Elisa called out to him. She then remarked that it would be wonderful if they could stop the flow of time. Hearing that, Abel considered that researching time-freezing magic might be worthwhile. It seemed achievable, and practical time manipulation could likely be developed within 5 years. Suddenly, Elisa began complimenting him. When he asked her to repeat what she had said, she quickly changed the subject. Leon, however, had heard everything, so he accelerated dramatically, causing Elisa to scream in surprise while Abel remained thoroughly confused. And that is where this story comes to an end for now. If you enjoyed it, leave a like, subscribe to the channel if you have not already, and comment, "Golden Eyes." The more comments you leave, the faster I can bring the continuation. I'll also leave 2 recommended videos from the channel that I'm sure you'll enjoy. See you next time, everyone.